Well, guys, thank you. You did your part. Now it's time I do mine. So Danganronpa 2 Goodbye Despair, otherwise known in its original release as Super Danganronpa 2 Farewell Despair Academy. What is there to say? It's arguably the biggest fan favorite entry in the entire DR franchise, and the comments on my previous video have very much backed this up. The tropical twist on the original entry's twisted high school killing game premise brought forth fan favorite characters, moments, and even some of the most impactful character arcs this series has seen. It introduced the iconic white-haired anime boy and skilled backup dancer to Sans the Skeleton, Nagito Komaeda, and it took the series to a more sprawling world, expanding its lore and opening it up for new story possibilities in the future. Indeed, it seemed despite the generally positive reception of the first entry, many are quick to point out their preference towards this one, and I can absolutely see why. Though I have few and far between nitpicks about this sequel which lead to me preferring the first game in some respects, almost everything between these entries has been improved in one way or another, and it leads to an even more boldly confident package than ever before. Super Danganronpa 2, as I'll elaborate on, is a game that's proud to be a sequel, despite the temporary uncertainty surrounding whether one would even be made before its release. And for good reason, because it makes very good use of its status as one, largely to iterate on several key themes, ideas, and structures that made the first entry great to begin with, resulting in something that not only feels bigger, but also something that builds off the foundation laid by its predecessor, in a way that really couldn't have been done if it were a more standalone or self-contained piece of fiction. These are things I'm going to be more than happy to get into over the course of our video journey here, but I suspect that in the process, we're going to have a lot more meat to chew on in this video as a result, so pray for me and the amount of work I'm putting myself through, I guess. So let's return to the world of Danganronpa once more for the second entry in this series retrospective. Keep in mind that this video should only be viewed if you've either played Danganronpa 1 or watched my previous video about it, as a lot of the sequel story is heavily reliant on knowledge of that game. In addition to the general warning of spoilers, please also note the content warning, which is also up now, as this game, like all other entries in this series, is very, very dark and goes to some pretty messed up places at times. Places that, if you're not prepared for them or receptive to them, would be more than understandable sticking points to avoid the content outright because of. Just take care of yourself, in other words. And without further ado, let's get into it. This is a retrospective of Super Danganronpa 2. As with last time, let's briefly go over some of the pre-release information we have about this game, its development, and the process of its creation. We have a little bit less knowledge overall of its early stages when compared to DR1's, of course, but we still have some interesting tidbits to note. So apparently, after development wrapped on the first Danganronpa, series creator and writer Kazutaka Kodaka was left in a bit of a pickle. No plans were actually in place for a sequel to begin development, and a lot of the game's development team went off to work on other things. Despite the uncertainty surrounding the property at the time, though, Kodaka didn't want to leave DR untapped, so instead of getting to work on a game, he sat down to work on a novel instead. This novel, Danganronpa 0, was written after Kodaka consulted with series producer Yoshinori Terasawa, and despite the fact that I rarely see it come up in the English fandom anymore, it's completely canon. Yeah, you heard me right, a spin-off novel written by the original creator that's 100% canon. Zero is essentially a must-read for Dangan fans, especially those who haven't yet given it a look. But we're not going to be going into all of its details today, just briefly skimming some of those necessary to wrap your head around DR2. Because yes, despite being a prequel to both of the main games, it's pretty important to both as well. Granted, DR2 isn't incoherent without rating Zero, but it does set things up a bit more organically, so that some of the material in DR2 doesn't feel as much like it comes out of left field at the 11th hour. You see, in the middle of writing Zero, a story which more or less functions to fill in some blanks related to the original game's plot, Kodaka was contacted again by Terasawa about the prospect of writing a full-fledged sequel game to Danganronpa 1, whereupon Kodaka began to write for both concurrently and finished Zero in October of 2011. Because both were in simultaneous development, Kodaka decided to slip hints of foreshadowing and branching connections between both games into Zero, leading to the story and world feeling a bit more cohesive as a result, which also meant that Kodaka was quick to request of gamers that they seriously consider reading Zero before playing DR2, and I'd honestly recommend the same if you're getting into the series nowadays. Zero unfortunately has no official English release as of this video, though DR is popular enough in the West that I'm not sure why. Come on, somebody get on that. But high-quality fan translations are pretty easy to come across online with little more than a cursory Google search. The main takeaways from Zero that you should be putting a pin in for later, for now though, are that Hope's Peak Academy is revealed to have received a lot of its funding through an additional campus building called the Reserve Department, a place where normie students apply through standard exam and ludicrous tuition to attend HPA with all the prestige of the brand name getting attached to their transcript without having to be an ultra-elite, super talented badass anime character. Of course, this excess of funds is funneled into a talent research initiative by the Academy, which apparently has resulted in some kind of strange human experiment on a mysterious person of indeterminate gender named Izuru Kamakura, the supposed super high school level Hope, which naturally all went wrong when a shadowy figure seemingly influenced Kamakura into slaughtering the Hope's Peak Student Council. With the flames of their mistreatment by the main campus fanned by this chaos, and the school seemingly trying to cover it up to protect their interests, the Reserve Course has now started a large-scale protest that the school has taken to calling the Parade, which seems to be just on the verge of a violent tipping point, perhaps only requiring a nudge in the right direction from someone, shall we say, charismatic enough to get the job done. And you can probably assume a little bit about what happens from there. The main plot, however, uses most of this as a backdrop, and is more about a girl named Ryoko Otonashi and a boy named Yasuke Matsuda, but we don't really have a lot of time to be getting into all that today. We'll talk a little bit more about this when I get to Danganronpa 3. That being said, with all of those tantalizing bits of foreshadowing dropped, Kodaka got to work on the sequel, with variety being added in the form of a counterpart to Monokuma, a stuffed rabbit named Usami, later rechristened Monomi. The tropical island setting was chosen over the more traditional school setting of the first game in a bid to provide players with more content to explore, with inspiration for the story's scope, twists, and general tone being taken from the television series Lost. After many months of development, art style shifts, and even the entire aesthetic of the game's setting being reworked, the game was finally released in Japan for the PSP on July 26, 2012, with the release arriving in North America on the PS Vita on September 2, 2014. Though the game initially received a Zero rating of C, 15+, in Japan, as the creators wanted to draw in younger audiences that couldn't previously purchase the first game, it was later re-rated back to 0D for ages 17 and older, when it was released in the Danganronpa 1.2 Reload collection. It, like the first game, is currently available to play in English for those of you seeking to do so on PS Vita, PS4, Steam, iOS and Android, and Nintendo Switch, thanks to the newly released Danganronpa Decadence collection, whether it be the physical-only bundle or individually on the Nintendo eShop. The game's original title, which I, as usual, prefer to refer to it by, and this time for more reasons than just preference, which I'll be getting into, is Super Danganronpa 2 Farewell Despair Academy, and is undoubtedly an intentional reference of sorts. To what, you may ask? Well, as you'll come to see more and more often as we talk about the game's plot, events, and story elements, SDR2 is very focused on being iterative in respect to the first game, and often in intentionally subversive ways that mimic the original game's structure, but often skew them in interesting new directions. This is more or less a callback to the era of emergent 16-bit gaming, the era where the Super Nintendo slowly began to replace the powerfully dominant original Nintendo Entertainment System. At the time, a common practice for showcasing the power of both the SNES and the developers working for it was to take a game that had made its first splash on the original NES and update or reimagine it for the SNES. Not to simply port it, but to restructure it in ways that made it feel unique unto itself, and while not all of them followed this convention, many of these games were even billed as actual sequels to their predecessors, functioning both as individual entries in a continuing franchise, but also retreading a lot of familiar and iconic structural ground in order to benchmark their creative progress. And of course, many of these titles would incorporate the brand-appropriate Super into their title, such as Super Metroid, Super Castlevania 4, the list goes on. And SDR2 is much the same, mimicking a similar progression but also deviation from the norm, working along that design philosophy of evolution and subversion, but also retaining just enough familiar structure and parallels to its originator that it became clear just how far the property and its creators had managed to come in such a short amount of time. And of course, this iteration proved successful for the at the time newly christened Spike Chunsoft. The game sold 69,000 nice copies during its first week on sale in Japan, growing to 162,408 copies during its PSP lifecycle, and was given a rating of 37 out of 40 by Famitsu, becoming the best voted game of 2012 by its readers, with an average reader rating of 9.79 out of 10. But what exactly is all this about? How does SDR2 take these concepts and one-up them in a way befitting the console-leaping reimaginings that it took titular inspiration from? To find that out, we'd have to get more into the game itself now, wouldn't we? So with our history out of the way, let's move on to the main event. Let's travel back to July 26th of 2012 with the release of Super Danganronpa 2, and start at the beginning with the prologue. Our story begins with the anime version of the Skyrim intro before we get a proper little flashback of what led up to it. Our new main character is everyman Hajime Hinata, played by Minami Takayama of Detective Conan fame, who has always admired Hope's Peak Academy for all of his life and has finally gotten the chance to be enrolled at it. Despite his excitement, though, some strange visual distortion overtakes the screen, kicking things off seemingly much more quickly than they were in the previous game. Before we can introduce ourselves to everyone in class, though, we've got another surprise on the docket in the form of a strange magical girl-esque bunny named Usami, who suddenly appears declaring herself to be the class's teacher and whisking the entire classroom away to an isolated tropical island, the walls falling away like they're part of a set. Usami, much like the animal mascot before her, is voiced by another widely well-known elderly woman whose voice is ubiquitous in the minds of many generations of Japanese youth, this time in the form of Takako Sasuga, whose voice is best known as Tarao Fugita on the world's longest-running cartoon, the anime adaptation of Sazae-san, running from October of 1969 all the way to the present day. Understandably, everyone is very confused about all this, but Usami seems insistent that nothing is afoot and that this is merely a school-sanctioned field trip meant to foster friendship and hope between the students, who will be given the opportunity to return home after they've gathered what she calls hope fragments, essentially points that they get for bonding with each other and learning more about each other. Although Hinata and the player's suspicions are raised, albeit for different reasons, the intro song that follows seems to solidify that this is a perfectly banal and sugary sweet affair laced with no trace of apparent foul play or murderous intent on the horizon. And with this feeling of uncertainty lying in the pit of our stomachs, we're tasked with going around the first island, both to feel out its various locations and introduce ourselves to the wacky cast of characters we're going to get to know across the game's plot. We first start with the aforementioned white-haired anime boy Nagito Komaeda, who has super high school level luck, similar to the previous game's protagonist Naegi. But the weird similarities indeed don't stop there, as he's also voiced in both the English and Japanese releases by Naegi's voice actors Bryce Papenbrook and Megumi Ogata, respectively. To top it all off, his name Nagito Komaeda can very easily be read as an anagram for Naegi Makotora, or I am Makoto Naegi. Combined with his talk of hope and his talent and even his similar fashion sense, it's easy to tell that Kodaka was really planning to mess with players with this introduction, and indeed he admits that it was entirely intentional. Komaeda, though, is, of course, not actually Naegi in a wig, but rather an apparently soft-spoken but somewhat reserved and self-deprecating fellow who just wants to see his friends grow and become even greater than before. Right? Across these introductions, we also learn a bit more about our protagonist Hinata himself. He's a bit more of a cynical sort than Naegi was, sharper-tongued and just as prone to sarcasm, but he also feels as though he has a lot more genuine social chemistry with his friends than Naegi did, which instantly makes him a lot more compelling and entertaining as a POV character in my book. To top that all off, it seems the shock of the situation has rendered him unable to remember his talent that got him into Hope's Peak in the first place, rendering him the SHSL triple question mark spot that was occupied in the last game by Kirigiri, which definitely raises some eyebrows to be sure. Running to the large airport, where apparently all the plane's engines have been removed, we're introduced to two more characters. First is Kazuichi Soda, the super high school level mechanic, a sharp-toothed tech enthusiast who, despite his exaggerated appearance, is actually something of a wimp. Second is Gundam Tanaka, the super high school level animal breeder, who is a strangely enthusiastic guy who often speaks in dramatic and dark declarations, emphasizing his greatness and powerful evil, always accompanied by his self-named 4 dark devas of destruction, which are hamsters who live in his scarf. He's also very obviously named after the Mobile Suit Gundam franchise, which I would assume is why his name is spelled so strangely in the localization when compared to how it would normally be translated from Japanese. Copyrights a fickle mistress. In the local supermarket, very much stocked despite the island's emptiness, we first meet Mikan Sumiki, the super high school level nurse, a sweet if very meek medical professional who is a lightning rod for bullying. And because of this, often preemptively, intensely apologizes for even the most minor of perceived offenses. Next up is Ibuki Miyota, the super high school level light music club member. She's very enthusiastic, cheery, and cute, and is stylistically defined by the most scene kid style possible. While in the localization her talent is much more generally referred to as ultimate musician, light music here refers to a common Japanese after-school club activity, similar to pop music, as each kanji of her name is taken directly from the 4 main protagonists of popular high school slice-of-life music club anime, K-On!, with the back of the Japanese packaging for the game even shortening her talent description to simply K-On!, as if we couldn't tell easily enough already. Despite this being her apparent reason for a rise to prominence, however, Miyota left her group due to creative differences regarding the genre direction of their sound, preferring to play heavy metal tracks that more closely resemble the influences of bands like Maximum the Hormone than they do, say, AKB48. At the Hotel Mirai, where we're apparently tasked to stay in cottages, we first meet up with Fuyuhiko Kuzuryu, the super high school level Yakuza. Despite his patented baby-faced exterior, he's very much a mafia man, with a hot temper, a foul mouth, and a flippant attitude towards achieving his ends with violence. Next up is Mahiru Koizumi, the super high school level photographer, a somewhat stern type with some light tsundere tendencies, who is always seen with her trusty camera, and who values the importance of documenting happy memories among friends and family. Then we have Nekomaru Nidai, the super high school level coach. He's a bombastic and super ripped fella who, despite his intense aura and tendency to shout passionately, is also just a genuinely nice guy who's determined not to compete in athletics himself, but rather to train other athletes to be the best that they can be, pushing them to surpass themselves with an abundance of encouragement and extremely personalized regimens. In the hotel's reception lobby, we first meet the super high school level swordswoman Peko Pekoyama, a very straight-laced and serious bespectacled girl who always speaks very curtly and honestly, seemingly always at the ready for whatever danger may arise, which very deliberately contrasts her almost cutesy-sounding name. Next is our gamer rep, Chiaki Nanami, the super high school level gamer. She's a very soft-spoken girl who is often afflicted by sudden onsets of sleepiness even while she's standing, and she often takes time to articulate her responses to things either because she's distracted or because she's just taking a minute. Despite all that, though, she seems nice enough, with good-natured curiosity informed by her seeming history with detective genre gaming, a sort of fun poke at the player who is, well, doing that exact thing right now. In the restaurant up above, we, regrettably, stumble first upon Teruteru Hanamura, the super high school level cook. Though his culinary skill is impeccable and his design is quite delightfully cartoonish, he's also the token pervert character who doesn't just make dirty passes or sneak peeks of what he's not supposed to, but actively seems to relish the thought in multiple canon sequences of dialogue of trying to trick people into unwanted activities, which is, very not cool or okay at all. Don't like this little man. Like it even less that he's evidently the canonically bisexual representation we have in this game, as he's an equal opportunity pervert, which I think is supposed to be played for laughs, but ultimately doesn't really send a great message when one of your only LGBT characters is a weird creep who wants to assault everyone with a pulse. The poor angel he's trying to coax is one Sonia Nevermind, the super high school level princess, and a diplomat of a foreign country brought to Hope's Peak as a transfer student. She tends to experience a lot of culture shock and confusion regarding Japanese customs, but her heart is in the right place for the most part, owing to her polite and prim demeanor only occasionally disturbed by her strange hobby of watching slasher movies. At the Usami Corral Ranch, we meet two new faces, but not before seeing Usami magically turn a chicken into a cow, which, aside from reminding me of a favorite cartoon, definitely brings to mind questions of what exactly she is if she's capable of doing something so outlandish. But that aside, we first get introduced to Hiyoko Sayonji, a tiny girl who looks a bit more like a grade schooler than a high schooler, who is the super high school level traditional dancer. Despite her childlike appearance and tendency to present herself as innocent and cute, she often slides right over the line into being a gleeful bully, who seems just a wee bit sadistic in her colorfully profane insults and her tendency to kill bugs for the heck of it. We also meet Akane Owari, the super high school level gymnast, a brash shonen protagonist type whose insatiable hunger and drive to fight powerful enemies makes her a bit like a high school girl version of Goku, with less mystical laser powers at her disposal, and that about sums it up. And last but not least, at the centralized Jabberwock Park, we meet, what's this? Byakuya Togami! Who's looking a bit different, obviously, but still bears the same name and talent of super high school level air as our favorite prickly prick from Danganronpa 1. Although right now he seems to have a bit of a softer leaderly side to him than last time. Maybe he's grown, but what's he doing here? And why doesn't he seemingly remember the events of the last game? Questions begin to mount a bit again, especially considering how little we know about this island so far. Despite our worries, though, it seems very few else are actually all that fussed about the idea of staying here for the time being. They're accommodated, the setting's beautiful, and they're promised a round trip home if they just cooperate and chillax, so what's the worst that could happen? As they're all called to the beach by Usami, nearly everyone begins a fun romp in the sun and decides to go swimming. Just as Hinata finally decides to toss aside his reservations and join in the fun, however, a mysterious, convenient onset of thick fog, roars of thunder, and a grim overcast rolls in to sour the sunny, funny mood. Seemingly just as confused about the commotion as you all are, Usami is blindsided by her monitors displaying an unseen figure that she hasn't given permission to operate her intercom. Beyond that silhouette is a familiarly frightening voice, and a shape that's unmistakable, who asks us if we've waited long enough for this boring opening act to come to its close. Promising a speed up in excitement, the stranger invites us to Jabberwock Park, where we all get our predictable but nevertheless hair-raising reveal of the terrifying teddy bear who started it all, Monokuma. Immediately berating Usami for what he perceives to be a boring slice-of-life plot that no one will enjoy, he quickly usurps her power by destroying her magic stick and rechristening her to Monomi, demoted to the position of serving as his fearful little sister, who he graciously pummels to assert his newfound control over the narrative. And of course, with his new author's license, what's he gonna change? Well, if you guessed the word murder was going to somehow be added to the equation, you bet your cash on the right pony. Yes, indeed, the tropical friendship vacation has now become an isolated island nightmare, where the only way to escape isn't singing Kumbaya and making memories, but rather severing ties and taking lives. Only someone who kills a classmate and survives a class trial can leave this place, and if the students had any delusions of resistance, they're quickly snuffed out as the park's statue comes to life as the terrifying monolithic robo-creatures he dubs Monobeasts, who set a stark example of their power by gunning poor Monomi down into bits. As everyone falls quickly into terror, the realization dawns upon them, just like those students in the gym so long ago, that the only person they can trust is themselves. And with the fun fake-out prologue out of the way, the true game laid out, we breeze past the previously shown fake opening into the proper opening. This intro, though longer than the first games by quite a bit, perfectly sets a tone, swerves around expectations left and right, and skillfully introduces a pretty huge cast. And of course, it's only gonna get crazier from here, as we move from the prologue to Chapter 1. As our daily life begins, Hinata is not too happy about getting himself caught up in this situation, for what I would assume are obvious reasons. Despite his reluctance to even acknowledge what's happening, however, Monokuma appears to him in the early morning to command he search for hidden Monokumas located on the island. This has no story significance, it's just goodies that will get you extra mono coins for the returning gift machines, which you'll use in the returning free time events. You've also got yourself a weird little Tamagotchi to raise that grows with every step you take in the overworld without using the auto features, which most people don't really bother with, but it's honestly easy enough to peek in on if you really care that much about it. At the cafe meeting, we have some discussions about what to do with the group, with Sumiki beginning her routine of falling down with her entire ass out gags, as Togami calls us all to Jabberwock Park to apparently show us something he's found that he deems curious. Said curiosity seems to be a strangely ticking timer device that's counting down to something, but nobody can figure out what it actually is. During the discussion, who shows up but Monami, who, surprise surprise, isn't actually dead, as she has spares much like Monokuma. Though she swears she's against Monokuma and his schemes, the entire class has more or less become suspicious of her by this point, thinking her to be in league with the murderous bear. And given the circumstances, it seems a fair response, even if something of a mean one. Before we can wrap this whole talk though, Togami suggests that this giant island with places like this being entirely uninhabited, seemingly without explanation, can only be the work of some large organization, though the details are a mystery to him, and he suggests searching the island for clues to see if anyone can discover anything about said potential shadowy puppet masters. Taking up a leaderly position, Togami also insists he'll ensure everyone's safety, something that rings sentimentally sweet even if he does harbor some of the same bossy and self-important tendencies as we last saw from him. Though you're able to spend some free time with friends now, it doesn't seem like many clues have unfortunately been unearthed, and everyone is called once again to Jabberwock Park in the nighttime, this time by Monokuma. The bear is holding a forced comedy show with Monami, complete with canned laughter, but in the middle of his routine of corny jokes, he stops the presses to reveal to the students that Monami isn't just responsible for bringing them to the island, but also stealing their school memories, about 2 to 3 years worth. If this twist seems familiar, you'd indeed be correct to remember that this was one of the big endgame twists of Danganronpa 1 that he's just unceremoniously dropping on our laps in the first act, complete with a thorough lampshading of this fact by talking about how such a, quote, cliché twist should have been gotten out of the way early because it could only possibly be saved for a story's end by a hack writer without any better ideas, which is admittedly pretty funny, but also continues to play into the way that SDR2 plays with your expectations and mirrors the first game's content in unconventional or twisted ways. Though everyone is understandably in disbelief of this claim, they're also still that much more suspicious of Monami because of this, and Monokuma reveals his intentions for dropping this little nugget of information so early. That's right, the first motive for murder is a return not only of their freedom, but also of their school memories, something that would likely entice those with the reason to be worried about what's happened that they don't recall. Not only that, he also drops the tantalizing reveal that there's a mole among the group, much like the case of Sakura from the first game, and as much as we'd like to deny that such a person exists, we've been through this whole shebang enough times to know that such a hope is ultimately futile, sadly. As we head to our cottage for the night, it becomes only a matter of nerve-wracking waiting to see what will happen next. During the morning meeting, Togami quickly takes charge once again to announce a party during the night, with mandatory attendance being put in place. If Monokuma's going to try to drive such a huge wedge into them early on, it only stands to reason that a big gathering to strengthen their belief in one another and bonds should do nicely to establish a foundation that they can hold on to, after all. Deciding to hold the party in an old cabin off to the side of the hotel grounds, they draw straws to see who gets cleaning duty, with Komaeda being the seemingly unlucky candidate for the job. With Hanamura on food duty, everyone gets excited for the festivities ahead. That is, everybody save for Kazuryu, who has no real intention of hanging around with everyone else due to his standoffish nature. After spending the day as we like, we head on to the party at night, going through a quick body check by Togami before we enter. Apparently, he's got a Duralumin case to store dangerous items in to ensure that this whole thing goes off without a hitch, and one mysterious extra case for emergencies. He even goes to the trouble of eating all of the meat on the sharply presented skewers to prevent them from remaining within reach of any prospective killers. And I honestly wish haha fat guy eats a lot of food wasn't something they seriously felt the need to keep doing with him here, but I'm not particularly surprised even if I find it obnoxious. From there, he goes on to check the rest of the place just to ensure that everything's okay, with the kitchen in particular housing a lot of items that he needs to remove. There, he briefly confides in Hinata that his life has been a living hell where he was forced to suspect others and be suspected in turn, and that's why he takes his position of keeping others safe so seriously, leading us to wonder if he really might remember the events of the first game. While Hanamura remains in the kitchen, Pekoyama takes her share of food to the office to keep on security detail, and Nanami goes outside to watch for Monokuma, as well as Kazuryu, who never showed. As everyone's finally having a great time, suddenly the power in the entire cabin shuts off, turning everything pitch black. In the panic, everybody stumbles and shouts until shortly after everything turns back on. While the first shriek afterward turns out only to be the result of Tsumiki tripping into another compromising position, it becomes clear shortly after that such antics aren't going to be the only thing we need to worry about now. It seems now that the lights are back on, Togami is missing. Checking every inch of the cabin, nobody can find him. Nobody can find Pekoyama, and the bathroom is barred off. Returning to the dining hall, Owari is quick to point out that she smells blood back near one of the tables. And though we're probably sure what to expect by now, it doesn't make it any easier to comprehend when Hinata throws back the tablecloth to reveal our first body, that of one Byakuya Togami. Obviously, this sudden twist of a tragedy is not a welcome surprise to the gang who was ready to give a good college try at strengthening their bonds, and this task isn't made any easier by Monokuma's return to the scene, giving them a Monokuma file and demand to investigate the crime, equip their suspicions, and get to solving the incident. Getting to searching, we find a wealth of clues. Under the table, we start with the blood spatter, some night vision goggles, a knife that was taped to the underside of the table, glow-in-the-dark paint on both the knife and tape, and a whole lot of blood. And later, the knowledge that Togami's stab wounds are numerous and very thin. There's also a table lamp with a long cord trailing to the side of said table. Still in the dining hall, there's also the AC unit, which seems to have just beeped before the blackout with its timer set to right around the time of death, and Koizumi's photos, which she took while everyone was having fun, solidifying everyone's positions. Apparently, just before the blackout, Togami was nearly across the entire room from the table he was found under. Meanwhile, it seems Gundam has lost his earring under the gaps in the floorboards, intent to find a way to recover it instead of assisting with the investigation. In the case of Togami's emergency items, we find a key to the case of confiscated ones being guarded in the office, meaning they have no relation to the case, and find that one of his preparations was obviously the night vision goggles found underneath the table with him. In the hallway outside, we note the large fire doors that exist to prevent the spread of fire in emergencies, containing it to one part of the building, and in the kitchen, we take stock of everything inside once more, including a portable stove which gives off light when being used. In the storage room, things get even more mysterious. 3 irons lined up on a board appear to all be plugged in simultaneously. Off for now, but certainly enough to seemingly force a breaker to kick. In the laundry cart, there also appears to be a cloth covered in blood. The breaker in the office unfortunately seems a bit too high to reach normally, and Monokuma confirms he was the one to turn it back on from there, meaning the killer wasn't the one responsible for managing that. The office AC is, however, set to the same time as the one in the dining hall, around the time of death. Here, we also rediscover Pekoyama, who won't specify where she was, only that she was feeling unwell. And this is also around the same time that poor Nidai is finally able to get into the previously locked bathroom, so it seems that mystery has basically solved itself. Outside, it seems Nanami is helping Gundam try to look for a way to get under the building for his earring, but he can't discover any way to actually get underneath from outside because of the gated edges. While we're there, Nanami also lends an alibi for the missing Kuzuryu, as while she was keeping watch with Monami, he apparently strolled by and returned to his cottage. Trying to cover all of our bases, we go to Togami's cottage to see if we can find anything that pertains to his death. Inside is a threatening letter he seems to have received in the morning, warning that the killing would start tonight, shedding light on his sudden decision to arrange said party and be so strict with it, so he could keep an eye on everyone and ensure their safety. Ironically, in doing so, he became the first victim himself. Upon returning to the crime scene one last time, Koizumi has provided help in the form of an approximate layout of where everyone was at the time of the blackout, helping us wrap our heads around potential layouts and trajectories. And Tsumiki clarifies the murder weapon had to have been about 5mm in diameter, much smaller than the knife found alongside the corpse. Calling for everyone to gather at the central island, Monokuma introduces them to their meeting place, a strange Mount Rushmore-esque carving in a mountainside called Monokuma Rock, which spits forth a large escalator meant to be taken to the elevator, which will then bring them underground for the class trial. And from there, the proceedings are afoot. Class trials proceed in a similar manner to how they did in the first game, with the primary way of procession being the non-stop debates, where we seek contradictions in given testimony and shoot through them with our truth bullets. This system has been expanded a bit, though, with the introduction of blue statements. While shooting regular yellow statements, we raise our objections to disagree, but when shooting the blue statements, we lend our voices to the contrary. agreeing with a person's assertion to instead let their voices be heard. I think while mechanically that this is a very simple addition, it does a better job allowing the cast outside of Hinata himself to actually seem both useful during a trial and much less obstinate or unintelligent. One of the big problems with trials in the first game narratively was that everyone was about as dumb as a sack of bricks to accommodate the player exposing their fallacies. Here, however, the opportunity to agree just as much to disagree allows some degree of variety that lets the characters shine a bit more. Additionally, we have the returning Hangman's Gambit, allegedly improved over its last iteration, and while I'd agree it's a bit more involved gameplay-wise, it's honestly way too overcomplicated for its own good. In this one, you have to merge different letter bubbles together to form a larger letter that you can use in the blank spaces. Let two different letters collide, however, and they explode, dealing damage to your influence gauge. This means that you need to fly back and forth between seeking letters to combine and use, and ones that you don't need to combine them and manually explode them before they can collide with others. This proves almost immediately troublesome in even the first trial, and the difficulty of these only gets steeper over time with longer phrases and way more characters floating on screen. And I honestly have to say that it is my least favorite minigame in the series because of it. It's just extremely intrusive, needlessly difficult, and monotonously time-consuming, and I hate it every time it comes up as a result. Improved Hangman's Gambit, this is not. I think they might as well have called it way more annoying Hangman's Gambit instead. And the last of the new additions to mention, for now anyway, is the Cross-Swords minigame, where you get into a one-on-one argument with someone who's raised an objection to your line of reasoning. You clash against their words with movements of the thumbstick to slice them, like with the sword, and you only have a limited number of strikes, so you have to be careful with your direction and timing. Eventually, a weak spot will be exposed in their words, like any other non-stop debate, and you'll be prompted to cut them down to size with the proper truth blade, bringing the discussion back on track. Though this can get a little frantic and difficult sometimes, I find this a nice change of pace to the usual trial system that adds a spot of variety in the right direction rather than the wrong one, and I generally have no problems with it. Alright, now on to the actual trial. The discussion starts with the matter of where Togami's body was found, which is confirmed by all of the surrounding blood on the tablecloth not to have been a secondary location. The cadaver definitely died there, but why'd he dive under the table during the blackout in the first place? Perhaps he noticed the knife covered in glow-in-the-dark paint and went to retrieve it? After all, he had night vision goggles, which he probably would have on standby for circumstances like this, and of course he had good reason to be paranoid considering the letter he received. But if the knife was covered in said paint, did the killer know the blackout would occur? That seems to be the case. Soda even argues that Pekoyama must be the killer because of her presence in the office near the breaker. But as we're quick to recall, she couldn't have reached said breaker, and she was almost certainly holed up in the bathroom, owing to a coincidental stomachache that couldn't have been caused by laxatives, as Owari also ate plenty of the same food she did. No, instead the blackout was caused by a power surge, a combination of the AC timers and irons forcing the max power limit to be reached and shut off all electricity to the clubhouse. With little progress to go on so far, it seems the hopelessness has begun to set in, with Komaeda even arguing that the greatest hope they could muster is in refusing to suspect their friends at all, just dying together to avoid such a thing, which seems sus. Before he can convince everyone to throw in the towel, though, Nanami suggests giving a look closer at Koizumi's map to unearth more clues. And that's when it hits us. Who could have been near the table trying to retrieve the hidden knife? Who was close enough that they could have, say, felt along the lamp cord to get there in the dark and find the glow-in-the-dark paint? None other than Komaeda himself, of course. After all, he did have cleaning duty, so he had plenty of opportunity to plan it, right? It would really hurt for another assistant to betray our trust at the 11th hour after being so kind and helpful to us for so long. But as Hinata pleads for Komaeda to correct his suspicions, his response is a bit unexpected. The Ultimates are working together to combat the despair of their friend's death. How wonderful, how beautiful it is!
Those eyes. The darkness in his eyes shone brightly, as if layers upon layers of darkness were folding into each other, as if hope and despair had been crudely mixed together.
Let's cut to the chase. You're correct. It was my doing all along. And just like that, Komaeda unravels, our presumed Naegi XP proving just how much of a twist on the protagonist's proclivities he really is. Despite championing hope the same way that Naegi did, Komaeda's hope is something twisted and desperate, founded upon the guiding principle of overcoming adversity. He believes that no matter how truly bad things become, that it will only serve to propel his friends forward to even greater heights. Though the words he says could be misconstrued as sarcastic by many, the fact of the matter is that he's entirely sincere. And that sincerity, that earnestness in wishing that those around him use massive tragedy and even human life as a stepping stone to solidify their hopes, just makes it that much clearer what an almost intentional perversion of Naegi's views he's constructed to be. He takes that rallying cry, that championing of togetherness that made the previous entry's ending so uplifting, and almost immediately flips our perspective, reminds us that all is well and good in moderation, but that even a good thing can be twisted with enough blind devotion. We'll get more into Komaida's mind palace later, though, as now that we've got an alleged confession of sorts, we've got to delve deeper into this. After all, he did seem to cave a little easily, only after garnering a smidgen of pressure, didn't he? Maybe despite the fact that we're already 40 minutes into this trial, there's a bit more to unpack here that we're not seeing. Despite his huge heel turn in attitude here, Komaida's not very combative toward taking the blame. And if we know anything about Danganronpa cases, it's that alleged murderers who were a little too cooperative are usually not telling the full truth just yet. So, how do we continue the discussion? Well, firstly by clarifying that he at least was responsible for planting the knife, causing the outage, and sending the threatening letter. He even got the convenient job of cleaning duty just by trusting his own luck, as it's what his talent is supposed to be. Despite not having any idea whether it would actually work, he just left it to chance and he happened to get what he wanted. Although according to him, once he went for the blade, he was pushed out from under said table by Togami, and the killing blow was not his work. Of course, while this doesn't convince many at first, Sumiki is quick to note something that we all should have noticed by now, that Komaida has no blood spatter on him. There's also the matter of figuring out what the murder weapon is, since the knife obviously can't fit the description based on size. Despite everyone's confusion at realizing Komaida may not be the killer, we've got to figure out who's behind this, and nearly an hour into the trial, we take an intermission. A new occurrence that happens in every trial of this game, and didn't in the previous one. We'll get to my opinion on those, broadly speaking, a little while down the line, but for now, we've got to get back to the action. So, whoever stabbed Togami must have been under the table, right? But if Komaida was already there, he definitely should have seen them, and there's not a whole lot of room. So how does that work? Well, obviously, somebody could have been under the floorboard! The gaps leave enough room to slide a thin weapon through, after all. We all know somebody must have been able to get underneath, even if it was barred off outside too, because Gundam has come to the trial ground with his previously missing earring. A fact he confesses is because he found a latch to a crawl space in the storage room. Though this initially seems to single out the only one not at the party, Kazuryu isn't backed into a corner for long, as his sighting by Nanami proves he didn't go inside, and therefore couldn't have accessed the space. So how did someone still inside move around in the dark? Simple, with the light that the portable stove gives off. If they took it from the kitchen and closed off the fire doors, they could have blocked the light from emerging into the hallway, found the crawl space, gone down with the weapon and the spare tablecloth, covered themselves, found the glowing mark of the paint from underneath the floor, and then aimed for their target. And, well, who would most easily be able to access all of this? Why, none other than the cook Teruteru Hanamura. Wow, really doing me a favor by getting this guy's jokes out of the game as quickly as possible. Though it's briefly argued that Miyota heard his voice along with the others in the dining hall, this is quickly shot down, as because of the gaps in the floor, if he shouted, it would really sound as though he were in the room like everyone else. Breaking down into a frenzy of deteriorating accent, Hanamura continues to protest, but surprisingly, a very strange piece of evidence comes back to assist. You see, back when Sumiki had her embarrassing anime crotch fall, obviously that's something a guy like Hanamura would remember were he in the room, considering how much of a senseless horn dog he is. Only problem for him, though, is that he can't seem to remember it or how Sumiki looked at the time, something which obviously proves he wasn't around when he says he was, right after the lights came back on. His last desperate excuse is that nobody can prove what the murder weapon was, so they lack critical evidence. But when thinking about where you could hide something thin and long in the kitchen, only one answer comes to mind. An iron skewer hidden in the— wait a second, we've got to play a rhythm minigame. Yeah, this is the fourth minigame, Panic Talk Action. Similar to the BTB from the previous game, this involves timing button presses with a beat to wear down a stubborn classmate's argument. Only this time it's honestly a bit more functional. It can still get just as hectic and messy at times, but overall the actual way it's put together seems a bit more seamless to me, so props for polish. This time, instead of ending with one final bullet shot, we end with a word scramble of a specific phrase matched to each face button on the controller, tasking us with arranging them in the correct order at the last second to dismantle their argument. And in this case, we do that by exposing the weapon's hidden location on the bone meat. I mean the meat on the bone! Obviously, it's something Togami wouldn't have thought to check in his sweep after all, and Monokuma's sudden hunger seals the deal on this mystery, seemingly. Within the meat's bone is indeed a blade, sheathed inside the ivory for easy concealment. In our 5th minigame type so far, we return to the delightfully manga-esque climax inference from the first game, arranging manga panels to summarize the sequence of events and put a final nail in the culprit's coffin. This time, the design is a bit better too, with only limited stock of panels provided at one time, making things a bit easier to file through and making each panel a bit easier to see with the free space it provides. With Hanamura's crime exposed, his motive is next on the list of things we need to know, and despite the fact that I'm not too fond of the guy, it is a pretty sad one. You see, while working the kitchen early, he caught a glimpse of Komaeda setting up and basically prompted a full confession of his intent from him. Terrified by what Komaeda was going to do, he formulated a plan to kill him when he tried to make his move. But ironically, it was Togami's night vision goggles that changed everything. Seeing someone move under the floorboards towards their location, even knowing that Komaeda was reaching for a knife he'd planted, Togami pushed him out of the way anyway, effectively saving his life at the cost of his own. It was only after the fact that Hanamura realized just what he'd done, and that Togami was dead instead of Komaeda. It was at that point that Komaeda decided to intervene further, offering Hanamura advice and willingly misleading the class to see whose hope would shine brighter between the survivors and the culprit. However, despite his insistence that it was for everyone's good to protect them, Monokuma is quick to point out that he knew the rules. Getting away with his killing would still mean everyone else's death but his own, and though his sentiment is definitely sweet-sounding, it seemed more like he saw an opportunity that he could justify to himself and took it. And unfortunately, that may not have been far from the truth. As it turns out, Hanamura's secondary motive was in fact the memories the bear had dangling over him. Having left for school years ago now, he recalls that his mother is waiting at home for him, maintaining their family diner alone and in poor health. Without any way to know what he's forgotten or how much time has passed, he was immediately terrified by the prospect of his mother's ailing health having had plenty of time to get critical. Despite never seeming to want to believe anything he was told about this situation, he believed it more strongly than anyone else in the end, and it drove him to kill in order to see if he had any place left to return to. And now he never will. As it's obviously the Danganronpa trademark punishment time, as Hanamura is feathered, yolked, and dragged by a chain on a helicopter over to an active volcano where he's dropped inside and deep-fried. Ironically, though he was always a culinary master who turned his nose up at what he called common food, he was turned into one of the most essentially common types of Japanese food, an additional cruel twist of the knife by Monokuma to an already humiliating way of dying. Though everyone is horrified, the mood is immediately brought to a hair-raising new low, as Komaeda offers to everyone that if they should want to overcome the odds again, they need only consult him, as he'll do anything to help, even helping them plan a murder where he's the victim, willing to die in any number of ways to act as a stepladder to those he deems truly talented and worthy. He even tells Hinata that they're similar to each other because of their equal amounts of admiration toward Hope's Peak, which he doesn't at all want to admit, but may prove troublingly relevant as time proceeds. Of course, galvanized by the horror they've witnessed, everyone is determined not to let another killing happen. We all know about how long that's gonna last. In a final closing moment back at the hotel, Hinata stands outside observing the stars, only to feel a strange sensation of being watched, as the timer in Jabberwock Park counts down a bit more, ending Chapter 1. This chapter is honestly a wonderful introduction to the game. Like I said before, I don't really like Hanamura as much, and his admittedly tragic circumstances only do a bit to alleviate that fact. I think the fact that the gross fan service moment played into the case is honestly obnoxious too, but what can you do? Anime will be anime. Aside from all those nitpicks though, this mystery is incredibly solid. The motive is very understandable, and the accidental quality of it makes it quite tragic. The actual process of how things went down was simple enough to make it a fitting first case of many to come, but also managed to be more creative and engaging in a way that made it harder to immediately jump to who the killer was like in the first game's first case. In fact, I'd say SDR2 overall starts a trend that it maintains throughout the whole playtime here, of having had me guessing who the culprit was up until nearly the very end of the trial, when I was playing for the first time. It's really hard to suss these things out, and I think it greatly improves the quality of the actual mystery solving in this particular title. The length, however, of these trials has gotten noticeably pretty long, with this whole section clocking in at around 2 hours and some change, and this being about the shortest in the game, too. The fact that they're all so long that they need an intermission proves to me that the pace could have used some tightening in development, and I think they got a little ahead of themselves in places. That said, though, this chapter has a very effective series of setups and payoffs, introduces its mechanics and tones spectacularly, aside from some small caveats, and delivers an introduction that easily beats its predecessors by a country mile. And with that high note to go on, we proceed with bright-eyed curiosity toward Chapter 2. We start with a speech from Komaeda delving more into his worldview, in the company of an unknown party. He talks about how all throughout history, people are told that they can go anywhere and do anything, but that as he sees it, that's simply not true. That there are those born with inherent talent and those who aren't. That no amount of hard work will ever surpass that and fully close the gap. It's this viewpoint about worthy and unworthy humans which makes him further believe in an inherent inferiority he has compared to the rest of his class, seeing himself as worth much less than them. But before he can continue on, he's interrupted by an unseen party telling him to shut up, man. Yeah, I get it. At the morning meeting, something stinks, but this time it's not blood. Apparently, it's actually Sayonji, who hasn't bathed for a while due to her lack of knowledge on how to tie her kimono. Though she doesn't seem prepared to take her lumps as gracefully as she expects everyone else to when she's dealing them out, Koizumi is quick to offer help in that regard, almost immediately getting Sayonji to attach to her hip. We don't have much time to talk about that though, as Monokuma also shows up to declare one of the Mono Beasts is missing. Apparently, Monomi has actually taken a lot of time and effort to fight one and actually managed to destroy it, meaning one of the previously unavailable islands is now open for access, much like the new floors of Hope's Peak that would open up after a trial in the last game. There's actually a small minigame mode dedicated to playing out these encounters between Monomi and the various Mono Beasts, and they're not very good, so I don't have much to say about them. They're also thankfully an entirely optional bit of side content, meaning there's no pressure at all to touch them. Obviously, with a new island on the horizon, we've got to check out what all the fuss is, so we cross the bridge to see what's open for our exploration and come across quite a few interesting places. Firstly, we have a library, which is chock full of books and seems to be something of a dedicated study center, where Sonia actually finds a pamphlet for the island, confirming it to be a place called Jabberwock Island. Togami briefly brought it up in the first chapter as a resort island, and this seems to confirm that suspicion, obviously taking a naming cue from Alice's Adventures in Wonderland, which may prove to be something of a relevant allusion to make later on down the line if the white rabbit who welcomed us here wasn't already enough of a nod on its own. Curiously, however, the pamphlet claims that the small central island of Jabberwock is supposed to have a large administrative building, which obviously clashes with what we've seen. Not only is this supposed resort completely empty despite its bountiful resources, but there's no administrative building in sight on the central island, instead only housing Jabberwock Park. Though Monokuma briefly shows up to tease that only the aforementioned shady organization everyone was talking about could be behind something of this scale, he declines to comment any further. Before we leave, as a fun note of interest, Sonia brings us back to her niche occult obsession, saying she's found magazines about the subject which talk about famous serial killers, one being Genocider Show, a name we should definitely recognize, and the eccentrically inclined Kira Kira-chan, or Sparkling Justice, a killer who wears hero masks and kills exclusively criminals. While the Kira Kira in Kira Kira-chan's name is obviously the part that denotes sparkling, as it's a common sound effect in Japanese, this combined with the killer's devotion to only slaying criminals might just give them a loose referential tie to another fictional fanatical killer who slays criminals in the name of justice, but that's just speculation on my part. Next up, after the library, we've got the pharmacy. There's not really a lot to note here, to be honest, but there are a lot of prescription drugs just lying around, so maybe somebody should watch out for that. There's a diner just down the road, who already has a customer in the form of Kazuryu, who quite colorfully tells us to get lost while eating a burger, which is just a hilarious visual, and who also says that we shouldn't keep trying to rope him into things because he could totally kill everyone here for the sake of his own survival if he had to. Yeah, we'll put a pin in that, little man. I don't know if I believe you. Off to the side of the road, we also have another smaller beach called Chandler Beach, complete with its own beach house. Before we can check it out, though, it seems Owari and Nidai are fighting? Well, sort of. They're just getting their Dragon Ball Z training montage on, with Nidai seeing great potential in Owari, but also thinking she's not utilizing her talent well, calling her movements and timing half-assed all around. This, of course, only motivates her shonen protagonist proclivities, meaning that she's definitely not going to settle for just that much. Inside the beach house is a luxurious room with a fridge, storage closet, and a bathroom under renovation. Of course, Monomi reminds us that changing isn't allowed here, and Monokuma bounds in guns blazing, hoping to have the opportunity to pump a pervert full of lead, disappointed that he jumped said gun while waiting for some action. Lastly on our list of places to check out, we have a mysterious ancient ruin which resembles a large school building covered in roots and plant life. It gives off an eerie vibe of a somewhat modern structure literally grafted in the earth, overtaken by the nature around it and hollowing it into something more naturalistic and haunting. Dusting off the large circular door at its front, we uncover something even stranger, a seemingly unfitting sci-fi-like passageway with the word future emblazoned upon it. A keypad seems to exist for entering a passcode, presumably to enter the ruin itself, but there's also a large machine gun affixed right next to it, which seems to disincentivize anyone from trying to brute force it. Though the idea comes up that this place might have something to do with the island's strange lack of inhabitants, Monokuma is quick to appear and point out something equally strange, that he and Monomi have no means of accessing what lies beyond this door themselves, and therefore have no actual clue what's inside of the ruin. Of course, before Monomi can ask Monokuma questions about what this means for his role here, he oras her into next week and declares he has high expectations for everyone to solve the mystery of the island that even he can't. Before everyone can depart, though, the subject of the traitor comes back up, and upon being asked about it, Monokuma gives the group another tantalizing clue, a group called World Ender, a name which he says is unavoidable despite how embarrassingly juvenile it is, because the group itself actually ended the world. Of course, everyone is in disbelief that such an organization actually exists, but knowing what we do about the state of the world from the end of the last game, well, let's just say our suspicions as players are probably raising quite a bit at this point. They even ask Monokuma if the group are a bunch of terrorists, and he responds, "Terrorist, huh? That might be accurate, but only losers are terrorists. If they manage to win, they become heroes. In that sense, they're more like heroes. They're the heroes who ended the world." Though he refuses to elaborate much further on the nature of the group who's involved, or even if he's a part of it himself, Monokuma does claim that the organization the traitor is working for, and the reason they're all on this island in the first place, is all the work of World Ender. And with that, he departs, leaving us to return to our cottages for the night. In the morning, at the meeting, Nidai and Soda clumsily admit that there's a reason that nobody's seen Komaeda in a while, and that's because they tied him up at the old clubhouse, fearing he'd do something after everything he got up to in the last chapter. Thankfully, we don't really have to follow up on that right this second, getting to mostly enjoy a day of free time before Monokuma ropes us all back to Jabberwock Park in the nighttime. As his new props would imply, he's got a new motive to present to everyone, and it's quite the unusual one for sure. He's created his very own video game for everyone to play on an arcade cabinet, that being a game called Twilight Syndrome Murder Case. As Nanami is quick to point out, Twilight Syndrome is in fact an actual series with multiple games and even several live-action films to its name. And this isn't just some meta joke where a video game franchise exists within a video game franchise either, because Twilight Syndrome is an actual property that exists in real life. It's a series of horror adventure games, which ironically, despite being localized faithfully in this Danganronpa cameo appearance, has never actually had any of its games localized for the West, remaining Japanese exclusive for its entire tenure. The games generally tend to follow high school girls exploring and investigating urban legends and paranormal occurrences, both in and around their schools and neighborhoods. The series took life originally on the PlayStation in 1996, with a two-part release a la Sonic & Knuckles, in that it was supposed to be one game before development issues forced it to be split up into two separate games. The following sequels, Moonlight Syndrome and Twilight Syndrome Psykai, would also appear on PlayStation in 1997 and 2000 respectively, with the new game only arriving on the Nintendo DS in 2008, whereupon the series went radio silent, aside from two live-action films in both 2000 and 2008. The first two games in the series were also directed by the ever-prolific Goichi Suda, aka Suda51, best known nowadays for his creative work on Killer 7 and No More Heroes, which means that there is now a legitimate tie between Monokuma and Travis Touchdown. Because you see, while the series was initially published and owned by Human Entertainment of Clock Tower fame, which explains a lot of its tonal and visual similarities to that series, it later became the property of Spike, which explains its ability to cameo so blatantly in SDR2, and in a manner that is extremely faithful to the overall design and feel of the original games, even if it's somewhat dumbed down for its much smaller scope. Monokuma takes a few meta potshots at how they shouldn't diss adventure games because they're convenient to make for budgetary reasons, and Nanami is saddened by his attempt to pin his own entry because she liked the series and feels that it's tainted by association. That being said, how is a game gonna get everyone to kill each other? Well, he keeps the details somewhat vague, but claims whoever clears the game first will have a clear advantage over others in terms of information. Information which may provoke a killing to occur, which would then ensure anyone who is in the know would be more prepared for a potential attack. This is basically an obvious trap, but that curiosity and sense of paranoia is obviously going to provoke someone to play this thing in secret, regardless of how much we wish that wasn't the case. And in fact, it does seem to be the case, as once we wake up to go to the morning meeting, we bump into Kazuryu acting strange and hiding an envelope under his arm. Like he got something for something. Under request from Koizumi, we bring a day's tray of food to Komaeda, who's still tied up. Despite Hinata trying to steel himself for the encounter, Komaeda's mentions of knowing Koizumi must be busy with something, and the fact that he now knows about the arcade cabinet prove troubling. And unable to take a second longer of his provoking, Hinata places the food down and leaves hastily. A day's free time allows us some time to distract ourselves, but ultimately as night crawls closer, the curiosity is just too much. We have to know what's going on with that game. So on we walk to Jabberwock Park, immediately seen through by Nanami, and also quick to note Koizumi on her way back from somewhere too, looking somewhat nervous. Making our way to Jabberwock Park, we start up the game, which contains a pretty telling note at the very beginning. Warning, this game is a work of non-fiction. Any resemblances to real persons living or dead is purely intentional. This little piece of survival horror is Monokuma's veiled way of communicating information to us about the past, in other words, a set of school memories that some characters have forgotten being involved in. Starting rather unusually with the second day, a group of girls with familiar speech patterns talk about an incident where the previous day they all discovered a body in one of the empty classrooms. Apparently, the girl was killed with a blunt object, and authorities suspect someone came in from the outside, having broke a window to escape. Apparently, the girl's school swimsuit was stolen too, so a pervert seems to be the likely candidate. Apparently, these girls kept quiet about their discovery and instead let a janitor who discovered it later on report it himself. Though they all seem to argue that this is for the best, one of the girls speaks up, apparently having taken photos of the body just in case, thinking that they might be questioned by police. As soon as she presents them, Girl E is quick to take them and rip them up, insisting that they be incinerated and that any remaining digital copies also be erased, a fact that seems a bit disconcerting considering the circumstances. Cutting forward to the fourth day, we actually play as Girl E, walking back home on her own. She's determined to forget about the incident, but is accosted by a voice that insists they won't let her, and will never forgive her for what she did. Cutting back to the other girls, it seems we know what happened afterward now. Peeking inside of a classroom, we see Girl E dead with a nearby bat, the apparent murder weapon. Immediately after, we get a game over screen, which adds down 5, a message that Hinata can't really seem to understand and assumes the game is over, not really able to grasp the full context of events because of how things were segmented up and skipped around. At the meeting, we learned that apparently Koizumi is off on her own, rather unusually, and has denied requests to come along. Furthermore, Soda insists we meet him at the supermarket at 2:30 for something secret. When we do meet him and go to the diner, apparently his whole plan was to intercept a girl's day out he overheard Sonia planning for Chandler Beach, wanting to hang out with them without just outright showing up by himself. Of course, unfortunately, he sucks at lying anyway, so he barely needed our help to begin with. I do feel a little bad that Soda gets done so dirty by the localization, though. While he's definitely not perfect in the Japanese either, the NIS translation makes him out to be way creepier in a lot of his dialogue than he ever was originally. Not to mention the bungling of his abuse backstory, which kind of helped explain his personality more. Oh well, anyway. While waiting, we actually see Kazuryu coming back from somewhere, who also seems flustered about something but slips away once everyone else shows up to talk. Shortly after, we also see Sayonji fleeing from the beach, crying about something. This mystery's fittingly distracted from by some cheesecake shots of the various girls in their bathing suits, however, Owari's being somewhat offset by the blood from her fighting with Nidai. Pekayama shows up entirely drenched, having apparently swam around the islands to see if she could get to another, but failing to make much headway. And Sonia entirely subverts Soda's hopes in a truly hilarious fashion by showing up in a full-body wetsuit. Ready to get our fun in the sun on, Soda runs to the beach house to make preparations when suddenly, he screams, and a body discovery announcement goes off. Before we even have much time to process what's going on, we rush to the front after being unable to open the side door, and inside, we discover the body of one super high school level photographer, Mahiru Koizumi. Incidentally, laying next to her body is a bat, just like the one that killed Girl E. It seems, after all, Monokuma's game did somehow lead to a killing. A quick cut-in to disclaim, Koizumi is one of 2 characters I completed the free time events of in this playthrough, and I think in doing so it highlights my love-hate relationship with the concept of the free time events. You see, Koizumi kinda gets a lot of flack from people who don't really know what her deal is, because if you go through the game without really getting to know her, all that you really gather about her is that she's kind of a plain busybody who seems to expect men to do everything for women, and this rubs some people kinda wrongly about her. What kills me about that is that she actually has a lot more depth that you only realize by doing her free times. And while I love the idea in concept of a system where you can only get to know certain characters better if you like them, having to balance your delicate time and hope like your own character hopes that they won't die before you can learn about them, this also means a lot of characters like Koizumi miss out on the privilege of having their development and backstories addressed by the main story very often, and therefore come across as somewhat half-baked or unlikable to players who don't really go out of their way to seek these scenes, sometimes making their deaths a little bit less impactful. That's why I kind of want to take a step back and highlight my experience getting to know Koizumi before addressing everything yet to come from this revelation, as I think it should highlight what I'm talking about in that it made this death much more devastating and sudden than it would have otherwise been. You see, Koizumi is, of course, a photographer, and she got that talent from somewhere in particular. Namely, she picked up the hobby from her mother, who was herself a famous wartime photographer. While Koizumi's mother won accolades and became successful painting portraits of the horrors going on outside the periphery of our normal lives, Koizumi took comfort in the inverse, photographing almost exclusively scenes of people spending time together. Often her subjects are caught making goofy, candid expressions. There's a naturalistic sense of vulnerability and sensitivity to her work that she often likes to depict specifically because it's so fleeting. "I never erase a photo once I take it," she says. "That's my policy. No matter what kind of photo it is, the moment captured in it only exists at that time." This is only further made understandable by the fact that while her mother is away for work, she claims to have almost exclusively to take care of her own father, who refuses to do anything for himself or indeed his own daughter. Always longing for that familial togetherness that she lacks, she retreated into the comfort of photography, and always faced with a father who wouldn't do his job by supporting his own child, she became embittered toward the idea of who she sees as lazy men who should be taking responsibility for those around them, but who often don't. In spending time with her and proving that we actually listen to what she has to say, take an interest in what's important to her, she slowly opens up and even asks Hinata to take a picture of her for the first time. She claims that she's never taken pictures of herself and wants to see what she looks like through your eyes, immortalizing that moment as one of many potential memories she hopes to make with you and everyone else in the future. And that's why, when her life is so violently and suddenly ripped from us, it hurts.
If this was all a dream,
Hinata says,
when did I begin dreaming? If this is reality, why is Mahiru on the floor covered in blood? I couldn't understand anything that was in front of me, and I couldn't believe in anything.
And with that devastating note in mind, we are afforded no time to properly grieve. A person we've gotten to know, to spend time with, and to build hopes for the future with, is now gone. And before we can even pick up the pieces, we've got to condemn another friend to their fate by figuring out who killed her, lest we suffer the punishment awaiting a class who can't stand to reveal the truth. So obviously the bat's the weapon. It's ripped right out of the game that the motive was based around, and Nanami's quick to admit that she actually did play it herself, and has seen more than we have, so we should probably check it out again later because Hinata's bad at video games. Koizumi's body was leaned on the side door when she died, meaning that's why we could only get in through the front. There's a weird cutesy anime mask on the ground near the body, which Sonia relates back to the story of Sparkling Justice, who also wore masks when committing crimes. The mask is from some sort of magical girl anime? Oh, I get it, another serial killer fake out, like Chapter 2 of Danganronpa 1. In the closet, there's a lot of crap, but one gummy bear. I cannot play the song, I'm sorry, copyright is a foul beast. Anyhow, that obviously seems like a plant to incriminate Sayonji, since we saw her running from the beach house and also see tiny footprints on the sand outside, so that's just way too obvious. Monami lets us know that the renovations being done in the bathroom are because the shower doesn't work, so no running water would be here for the killer to utilize for whatever reason, should they need to. And the window inside of the room is pretty high up to be crawling out of, even though it most certainly can be pushed if you were high enough. There's also a bunch of empty water bottles in the trash that weren't there the other day, and the fridge is a lot emptier for them. Deciding we've got everything here, we head to check out the game, and oh son of a bitch, Komaida's here. Apparently he's solved the mystery of the game too, because everyone but us might as well have by now, and we sit down to figure out what we missed. Of course, this should be obvious, as the game over message down 5 obviously meant we should press down 5 times on the title screen, which lets us fill in the missing days we didn't get to see before. The first day actually covers the body discovery, where the girls hear a crashing noise, presumably the window, and go up to investigate, whereupon they find the dead girl. There's a broken fish tank nearby, which implies it got knocked to the side in the killer's haste to escape through the broken window, and they suspect the alleged pervert as the culprit because of the missing swimsuit mentioned before. On the third day, we finally get to the bottom of Girl E's weird behavior, because Girl D found a shattered vase in the room next to the body, meaning it was probably done to draw everyone's attention to something that had been done before. It becomes pretty clear that Girl E did the deed and pinned it on an unrelated perv. Girl D took photos of the vase and wants the truth, at which point Girl E basically admits to the murder for Girl D's sake, saying she knew Girl D was being tormented and bullied by the victim. Though Girl D seems to be trying to cover for Girl E, she also seems pretty shocked about the whole thing, and not in a particularly good way. Girl E tries to burn the photos, but a guy named Guy F finds the remains of them, and already suspecting Girl E gets pissed, saying he'll never forgive her for what she did to his little sister. This means that Girl E was probably killed later by Guy F in a manner that resembled the previous murder as revenge. This pretty much makes the case obvious, given the previous evidence, but the credits hammer it in further by listing the cast as Sumiki, Koizumi, Saionji, Miota, Sato, Kuzuryu, and Kuzuryu. Despite clearing the game, though, we can't have the end prize because only the first winner could get it. Komaida calls everyone associated to the airport to question them, and although none of them obviously remember the game's story since it took place within their school memories, they all do admit Koizumi was attempting to wrangle them together for a talk, but was unable because everyone was busy. Saionji claims, however, that Koizumi never talked to her at all, which... sus, but again, too sus. Investigating Koizumi's room gets us the prize envelope, which contains photos of Sumiki, Miota, and Saionji from their time in school, obviously taken by Koizumi, and also the aforementioned photos of the broken vase and a girl murdered inside of the Hove's Peak music room, who also has some pretty obvious blonde hair and blushy cheeks we might recognize. Lastly, there's a photo of the body from the game's last day, Girl E, or Sato, lying dead with a bat next to her, and a note that reads, "Try playing Twilight Syndrome. After you get a game over, press down 5 times for the real game. Once you do, you should remember what you all did to my sister. We'll talk then." And well, we all know who was holding an envelope a while back and who seemed to be unwilling to talk to us all in something of a more suspicious manner than usual, but did Kuzuryu really kill her? He seems even more obvious than Saionji at this point, and again, if we're going by the framework of DR1's second chapter, we had an obvious scapegoat, a still fairly obvious scapegoat, and a hard right turn true killer who we didn't see coming, so we're still probably one layer removed. And also, this is the point where Sonia mentions the only interview ever taken with Sparkling Justice by a reporter was in Spain, where they belted their catchphrase and also murdered the interviewer to protect their identity. A bit against the whole only villains policy, but that would still make the potential reference pretty accurate, I suppose. Our last sliver of information comes from Sumiki's completed autopsy, confirming that Koizumi probably died immediately after being bludgeoned, and that she didn't have any time to actually do anything or move afterward. In her pocket, a note was also found saying, "It seems there's someone who wants to interfere with our meeting. Let's keep it a secret. Until then, let's try not to see each other for a while. It would be bad if they started suspecting us for no reason. Signed, Hiyoko Saionji, specifying a time to meet at the beach house." Oh, also, Komaida snuck into Saionji's cabin while she was out and traced her shoes to confirm her footprints, and took a package of her gummies to compare them to the one found in the closet. And that makes our evidence roster to head into the trial with. Woo boy, let's get into it. So first, to understand this case, we've got to solve the case within the case, the Twilight Syndrome murder case, and it should be pretty obvious who's who and how it went down at this point, for the most part. Girl E, Sato, was the murderer in the first case, who stole a school swimsuit of one Little Miss Kuzuryu and filled it with gravel to bludgeon her with, then disposed of it. She wrecked the room, broke the window, and went to the office to get the key to the room, which she'd locked from the inside, and this was all way before Sumiki, Miota, Koizumi, and Saionji met each other in the main hall later. She then broke a vase in the neighboring room to draw everyone there so they could see her unlock the door, discover the body together, and assume the sound was the window being broken directly after the murder occurred, when it had actually been some time. Discovering the discrepancies, Koizumi hid Sato's involvement but wanted her to come clean, and Sato tried to destroy the evidence later rediscovered by our Kuzuryu, who took his revenge by killing Sato in the same manner his sister was killed in. Obviously, all this gives Kuzuryu a pretty good motive, but he seems to keep denying the game is even real, despite us knowing that it very much is. Still, the planted evidence against Saionji comes up as a result, and it's time to pick all that apart so we can proceed. While she initially denies going, the letter found on Koizumi's person calls this into question, but she actually has no idea where it came from. Following that lead, we can pinpoint Saionji was at some point in the beach house closet because of the gummy on the floor, with it being alleged that she waited for Koizumi and then attacked but misjudged where her body would wind up and was forced to leave through the front, making footprints. The gummies don't prove much though, as the only brand Saionji is known to eat and are hoarded in her room have no yellow flavor to speak of, meaning it's an obvious plant by someone else. Furthermore, Koizumi couldn't have crawled out to the door to block it intentionally because she died instantly, as per Sumiki's autopsy. That means only the killer could drag her, but seeing as Saionji had no blood on her and can't tie her kimono by herself, she couldn't have cleaned herself up afterward. Furthermore, the water in the beach house wasn't working anyway, so even if she could clean herself alone, she would have had no way to without passing someone covered in blood. Owari was covered in blood, but Nidai can back up her reason was simply because she was fighting him, and he saw it himself. It's at this point that Saionji admits that Koizumi really did come to her earlier to ask about a meeting at a certain time and place, and she's the only one who agreed. However, at a certain point she got a letter in her cottage mailbox from Koizumi which matches the exact wording of the note found on Koizumi herself, specifying a slightly earlier time. With the handwriting and phrasing looking similar in both, this was obviously a plant by the killer to lure them both out and to entrap Saionji for potential framing. When Saionji went, she was drugged and placed in the closet. When she came out, she saw the body and ran, meaning the killer must have intentionally placed her there, killed Koizumi, set up her body, cleaned up, hid in the closet in an empty surfboard case, waited for Saionji to get up, see the body, freak out, and rush away, leaving her footprints behind, then planted the gummy and made their escape. In the process of thinking about the killer's arrival and departure, we also get our last unique minigame, the Logic Dive, where we control Hinata on a mind snowboard and take him through various geometric tunnels where we're asked a sequence of leading questions and must take the correct branching pathways corresponding to answers until we arrive at the end. It's pretty decent, and I enjoy it a lot more than most of the other minigames. Plus, the snowboard is something of an obvious yet cheeky little reference to Minami Takayama's tenure as Conan Edogawa again, because of Conan's signature skateboard that he rides all the time. It's at this point that Komaeda makes an observation. Since the body discovery announcement that goes off when 3 or more people find a body went off when Koizumi was discovered by Soda, and Saionji obviously saw it before too, and the killer obviously saw it, was the killer counted as one of the 3 or more people needed to trigger the discovery announcement? Monokuma's reluctant to disclose this fact, as the announcement isn't really meant for deductive purposes, just a fair trial, but he reluctantly concedes and admits that the announcement doesn't include the killer this time around, meaning at least 4 people must have seen the body in total by the time Soda was added to that list. Back to the subject of the killer's cleanup though, how'd they wash off without the shower? Simple, the water bottles that they threw away. With no opportunity to dry off, however, who's the obvious pick? Well, none other than Peko Yama, of course. She wasn't lapping the islands for a swim after all, that'd have been a little silly, right? Kuzuryu strangely tries to stick up for her and say he saw her coming back from her swim on his way to his cottage, but Hinata's quick to point out that he just said earlier in the trial that he saw no one on his way back, so he's obviously lying to protect her. But why is that? He does bring up a good point, though, in asking how Pekoyama allegedly escaped. This, unfortunately, seals her fate, though, because the method of escape proves it's only Pekoyama who could have done it. Through the small bathroom window, she climbed using her sword as a prop against the wall, then used its carrying bag as a tie around it to pull it through with her on the way out, gracefully escaping and ready to return to the restaurant. Of course, since she had no time to dry and there were no towels in the beach house, she had to make her swimming excuse, but it's no longer holding any water. It's at this point that Pekoyama takes a hard right turn into unexpected serial killer territory, trying to reveal herself as Sparkling Justice, which Monokuma bemoans as old crap being retreaded, and comes across as very funny considering the magical girl mask and talk of justice brings to mind another one of Pekoyama's voice actress Kotono Mitsuishi's most iconic roles. Eager to wrap this up as they become increasingly unnerved, we summarize the case one more time in classic Danganronpa fashion and vote for Pekoyama, who strangely seems indifferent to all this. As the vote is cast, Sonia raises objection to note something she only just remembered, that Sparkling Justice was from Spain, as confirmed by the interview with them. Furthermore, when asked to recite their catchphrase in Spanish, Pekoyama can't do it, so clearly she's not actually Sparkling Justice, meaning the familiar serial killer reveal from DR1 isn't being repeated wholesale. It was just a familiar trope to get our guards down and nothing more. Pekoyama wasn't working at it from a meta level herself, though, of course. She just figured acting freaky would get our votes in quicker, and she was right. This is where she makes her argument for us being wrong. Because you see, while she may have technically killed Koizumi, she argues this was at the behest of someone else, whom she served faithfully as nothing but a mere tool, exerting no will or motive of her own in the process. At this point, it should be pretty obvious who she's referring to. Yeah, Kazuryu and Pekoyama knew each other, for their entire lives, in fact. Pekoyama was orphaned and taken in by his Yakuza clan, given everything in exchange for becoming young Master Fuyuhiko's humble 24/7 bodyguard and hitman. Stubborn and resilient as he was, he always pushed back against having one, but clearly cared for Pekoyama. Even demanded at the start of the school trip that they abandon their professional ties and that Pekoyama live a life for herself. Remaining stubbornly loyal, however, and seeing a meeting occur between Kazuryu, enraged by his sister's death, and Koizumi, whom he viewed as complicit in it, she acted in what she thought was his will alone and killed her, to which she argues it's incorrect to classify her as the killer, as she was simply to be wielded for Kazuryu's will. This would entail Kazuryu basically admitting Pekoyama was nothing more than a tool to him, though, and not only that, but agreeing that he wanted this. And as we can see from the flashback, though he was definitely angry at Koizumi, maybe even planning to kill her, he was conflicted about it. When he went to meet her, she was clearly and had clearly been upset and ashamed of everything, and despite her confusion, wanted to make amends. The only mistake she made was getting him fired up by insisting that despite Sato's crimes, he shouldn't have committed another murder in retaliation, as that made him just as guilty of murder himself. Sensing that rage building up inside of him from her words, that's when Pekoyama jumped in. But as we can clearly see, Kazuryu is horrified by it, knowing that it will only get her found out and executed, and demanding she forget her debts to him and just seek to get away with it. Clearly, because of this, we come to our ultimate conclusion that Pekoyama's argument just doesn't hold up. And despite Monokuma knowing this, he actually was compelled by her logic for a bit before finally giving up on it.
And here I thought it'd be more brutal and heartless,
he says.
Man, how disappointing. Which means everything happened thanks to her meddlesome actions. There's no way a human that meddlesome could ever be considered a tool.
Pekoyama admits that she was afraid that this would happen, that Kazuryu is too kind-hearted deep down, despite his appearance, to abandon everyone to their deaths. As a last request, she asks him to remember the tool that always stood by his side. But in a truly heart-wrenching moment, he says that he never needed a tool, that since they were together ever since they were kids, she should understand more than anyone that all he wanted was her all along, and begs her not to leave him alone. Only realizing in that moment how much she truly meant to him, not as a tool, but as a person, as someone he truly loved. Pekoyama weeps bitterly as she realizes the enormity of her mistake, and the fact that in response to his final, most desperate plea, for once, she cannot give him what he's asked for. Puppeted like a voodoo doll by Monokuma in true all-encompassing tool-like fashion, Pekoyama is made to face an army of wooden samurai dolls, buckling under the pressure of a wave of enemies. Kazuryu tries to cut in to save her, but ironically, the hands which were always meant to protect him are forcibly made to cut him down, and in her final moments under no one else's control, Pekoyama shields Kazuryu with her own body as the dolls repeatedly impale her, her blood trailing the ground she walked. Though Kazuryu isn't killed, he's barely alive and is taken away by Monokuma's suddenly appearing ambulance for emergency treatment. As the timer in Jabberwock Park crawls closer to its end, Monomi stands alone, talking to an unseen party, asking if they can see everything going on. She questions whether it would really be hope or despair for the kids to escape this island or live on it forever, and says that the alternative would be the resurrection of super high school level despair and a continuation of the tragedy, and that this is all for the sake of a future filled with hope. Ending Chapter 2. This chapter is honestly one of the best in the series for me. The clever incorporation of a game inside of a game, the introduction of the logic dive, the creative but still easy enough to solve murder plot, and even the fun skewing of expectations from the first game's second chapter is all excellent, and it's all wrapped into a nice bow with the narrative surrounding Kazuryu and Pekoyama, which is just about as heartbreaking as it gets, folks. At the beginning of this game, I didn't really have strong opinions about either of them, aside from that Kazuryu was a grade A jerkbag, and here he is making me cry like little baby. I really cared about the victim in this case, but I also really cared about the perpetrators, and I can see how everything about this case all tragically came together, and that makes it both a very satisfying mystery and a heartbreaking character study, with some of what I find to be the best writing in the series overall. It's one of my favorite chapters in DR history, and it gets high marks from me because of it. It'll be hard to top this, and unfortunately, Chapter 3, for a variety of reasons, doesn't really stand a chance. Chapter 3 is my least favorite chapter in the game, let's just go ahead and get that one out of the way. Yet despite this harsh claim, I doubt it will come across as nearly controversially to viewers as my complaints against Chapter 2 in the DR1 video. As what I've come to understand is that most people who play SDR2 call Chapter 3 their least favorite in the game. Ergo, I'm not particularly unique in this instance, and my voice is just one of the many in an anguished choir of groans that makes up the common complaints about this chapter. Still, while my criticisms for it will likely be nothing so unique as to be refreshing or uncommon, I will still try to articulate them as best as I can, so let's get into it. We begin the chapter with Saionji trying her darndest to make a shrine to Koizumi's memory, and although it's heartfelt, it's unfortunately giving off pretty creepy vibes, which throws everyone off. Saionji herself even pretends to hate it until everyone finds out that she was the one who put it together, upon which she cries and everyone apologizes, calling it out as the ultimately sweet gesture it really is. Monomi appears to let us know that a new island is open again, and that she's not really sure what's going on with Kazuryu. On the new island, we have a hospital, a music venue with an interesting name, hailing from an even more interesting movie reference, a motel building with the Waffle House sign, and an avenue of scrap electronics. On one of the scrap laptops lies a strange file that speaks of the tragedy we heard about in the first game, only it elaborates a little bit on it too. It basically talks about the revolt caused by the previously mentioned parade from Danganronpa 0, specifically mentioning the disenchanted reserve course that came up when I was talking about that before. Apparently, the conflict was confined to the campus originally, and they were hoping it would die down, but some kind of authority was apparently exerting its influence behind the scenes, causing things to escalate to a worldwide scale, provoking riots all over and, quote, spreading like an infection, very similarly to how Junko described it all back in DR1. It briefly mentions Hope's Peak's closure and the remaining students being forced to kill each other, but then garbles beyond readability. Before we're done with the island, though, we've also got a movie theater where Monokuma is apparently showing a movie of his own creation, which Hinata unsurprisingly has no desire to see. At the prize counter, there's a Monomi tote bag, which you get an extra of if you buy it, and a "I'm sorry I was born stupid" sticker, which Monokuma agrees to let Hinata skip the movie if he buys it, for $1.5 million. Asking if he can pay Monokuma after the killing game is over, and being told he can, he makes the investment, and feels pretty foolish as a result. Meanwhile, Komaeda exits from seeing the movie, declaring that it was so bad that if he were given the option to have paid $1.5 million instead of seeing it, he would have gladly paid the price and regrets that he didn't do so, which is bar none probably the funniest moment in this entire game to me. Once we've wrapped our investigation, we return to the hospital to find what a surprise. Kazuryu is actually here, and although most everyone is glad he's okay and just wants him to rest up, Saionji is understandably pretty miffed, both about being framed and Koizumi's death. The next day, everyone briefly discusses the strange laptop, and Sumiki confirms that while Kazuryu will probably be discharged within the week, he's likely lost the ability to use one of his eyes forever due to his injuries, and after this we get some free time. I honestly have to say, replaying this chapter, that everything up until the actual murders themselves is pretty damn well done. The actual vibes between this cast is extremely charming, and I genuinely buy that most of them are friends, as opposed to the DR1 cast, who kinda took a while to really feel like they had any real camaraderie at all. I actually buy their interactions a lot more here, and I also buy Hinata's relationship to them all more too, which elevates him easily above Naegi in terms of being an interesting protagonist. This genuine connective tissue between the characters makes their bonds very convincing and wholesome, and only makes the moments where they break apart due to crimes or what have you so much more tragic as a result.
The next morning, Miyota just busts right into Hinata's room to summon him to breakfast, because she do be wildin', I guess. And when we arrive, we instantly see what the hubbub is. Kuzuryu has returned to the group early, and he makes a great effort to readjust his attitude, reintroduce himself to everyone, and apologize for his blunders, even dropping to his knees in front of everyone. Of course, Saionji chides him, asking if he really thinks such a half-assed apology would make them forget what he did, at which point he starts bleeding from the stomach. It turns out, nope, he had bigger plans than just saying sorry, namely slitting that sucker open to show his regret and shame in true Yakuza style, after which he says that no, he wouldn't expect anyone to be satisfied with such a half-assed apology, and he's wheeled off back to the hospital by Sumiki, all of which gives Saionji some pause and reason to reconsider her harsh words. As Nanami asks her what she thinks Koizumi would say to all of this, Saionji trails off, with Hinata providing some food for thought in his inner monologue.
It's definitely not possible. There's no way it'd be that easy to move on. We never had to think about death until we came to this island. So when we're forced to suddenly confront it, there's no way we'd know how we're supposed to deal with it. We're not that strong.
At night, we're once again invited by Miyota to a party at the music venue to celebrate Kuzuryu's recovery, which he actually shows up to, further solidifying his reformation in the group. This is the point where I have to come clean and say that Kuzuryu literally started as one of my least favorite characters and became one of my top favorites, leading me to go from scowling at him to going,
little baby man, little baby man, little baby man.
I just really like him a lot, okay? His development is so genuinely sweet, and you can see how much Pekko's sacrifice for him really made him reconsider the way he interacted with others and change for the better as a result. Anyway, Miyota plays some unexpectedly hardcore metal to everyone's shock and horror, but this is all interrupted when Monomi appears to tell us in horror that Owari is facing Monokuma in battle on the beach, something bound to get her killed. Rushing there, we catch them right at the climax of battle, where Nidai jumps in Piccolo saving Gohan style to shield her from Monokuma's cannon blast. The injury proves nearly fatal, but Nidai is wheeled away to medical care by Monokuma since he wasn't the intended target, and he's effectively removed from the fray of this chapter for the foreseeable future, causing the group's harmony to fracture just slightly. The next day, things have gotten worse, as several people are behaving strangely. Komaeda can't stop telling bizarre lies, Owari can't stop crying, and Miyota is acting strangely naive and crazed. Not only that, they all have superbly high fevers. Something is up, and Monokuma quickly appears to give us the 411. That being that they all apparently have a strange disease called despair disease, which manifests in everyone differently, but can seriously threaten their lives nonetheless. It's also contagious, and since Monokuma has no intention of handing over a cure, this pathogen will serve as his next dastardly murder motive, as everyone can desperately attempt to quarantine and manage the disease, but run the risk of having more people be infected over time, or the infected to become crazed killers themselves. Only if someone is killed does it seem the disease will be directly handled by the one who made it, and we of course have no idea how Monokuma managed the tall order of creating a whole disease all on his own. Deciding to get this situation as under control as possible, the gang brings the infected to the hospital and assigns Sumiki as their nurse, with Hinata and Kuzuryu as hospital watch people. The rest will stay in the motels, and both parties will coordinate their efforts to treat the infected and find a possible cure via remote transceivers that Soda finds in the Electronics Avenue and wires to work wirelessly over a certain distance. They set certain times to check in with each other, but they have to catch each other live because there's no recording function on the camera and transceiver sets themselves. Most everyone's cool with the plan, but Saionji basically holds herself up in the motel after this, having no intention of risking infection for even a second. At night, Hinata finds Sumiki sleeping on top of him to add to our weird anime shenanigans counter, and almost suffocates. Something which Kuzuryu really hilariously responds with chagrin to, not because he's jealous or anything, but because for a literal member of the Japanese mafia, he's surprisingly against the idea of teenagers fooling around. Guess he's really all about his abstinence. Anyway, Komaeda's not breathing, that's bad. So rushing to his room, we find out that his condition is pretty critical, meaning things are gonna get bad soon if a cure isn't worked out. Things, unfortunately, do not seem to work out, as much time passes without any progress. At night, Hinata has a strange dream where he's in a classroom surrounded by people talking about how even a normal, boring person like him could get accepted into Hope Speak Academy without a special talent, making him fear the worst about why he supposedly can't remember his. In the morning, having to wriggle out from under a surprised sleeping Sumiki again, he's told that Komaida's condition has stabilized somewhat, and he visits the hospital to see just as much as Sumiki goes to nap in the on-call room. Going to wait for the morning video call from the other group, he notices the light flashing early and answers to see an eerie video of someone in the music venue with a tote bag over their head, in a hospital gown, climbing a stepladder to hang themselves as the light of the candle in the room suddenly goes out. Fearing the worst, Hinata runs out to check on things and discovers that, in fact, the victim he was too late to save was Ibuki Miyoda, whose corpse is dangling inside of the venue itself. Noting the scrap of the destroyed camera and transceiver set and a strange heat inside of the venue, he rushes out to get the others, coming across Gundam and Monami at the motel, and nearby Nanami, Kazuryu, and Sumiki. Concerned that Miyoda has seemingly disappeared from the hospital. Hating to deliver the grim news, he leads them back to the venue, but finds the door somehow barred, which forces them all to break the door down, resulting in their discovery of a Danganronpa Chapter 3 staple, a second body, this time being that of Hiyoko Sayonji. This is kinda where the chapter falls apart for me. Let me go on record to say that I don't dislike the final roster of survivors in this game, but I do find the fact that Sayonji dies here to be a real waste of potential. The fact that she was having something of a similar arc to Kazuryu going on, in that she was originally quite rude and horrible to people, but lost someone close to her and seemed to be on the verge of becoming a better person, seemed like a perfect and ripe opportunity to expand on her character and sort of work at redeeming her nastier qualities. Therefore, considering that this arc seemed to be fully in motion, the fact that it just stops dead in its tracks here feels somewhat anticlimactic and disappointing. I know that it's probably part of the point to have a character whose growth is cut tragically short by the very sudden and horrible death that makes Danganronpa itself so despair-laden in the first place, but I felt like they could have done a lot more with Sayonji that just would have been more interesting, and killing her here just seems like a short-sighted choice to me. Furthermore, while I generally like the mystery in this case more than the third from DR1, finding it much more mechanically interesting to investigate and figure out, it is a little bloated nonetheless. It's not as immediately obvious who's behind everything, so that's definitely a positive over that case, but even so, there's still a lot of evidence to go through, and it does make the whole thing seem to last longer than it maybe should if you're picking up what I'm putting down. But hey, at least the despair disease is suddenly over, apparently. Monokuma got bored of it once a murder finally happened, so he's retired it right away, and we can focus solely on the investigation and upcoming trial. So, what's that evidence? Well, let's review. The broken radio equipment at the scene, a Monami tote bag, a noose, blood on Ibuki's feet, a stepladder with traces of blood on its side, a candle, black slips of wallpaper over the baton lights, the baton itself and the wallpaper on it, the state of Sayonji's body, her bindings, a motel key inside of her kimono, a curtain seemingly from the supermarket, the absurdly high AC, a smudgy trace of blood on the stage, seemingly torn wallpaper, a full-body mirror, a broken drumstick near the door itself which doesn't have any locks, weird glue on the inside of the door, Mikan's autopsy where she claims the time of death is obfuscated by the heat, and that's all just in the venue. Next, we need to go to the theater, because apparently, according to Komaida, the killings seem to be copycatting it somehow, meaning we promised the 1.5 million for nothing. We get our one-time ticket and go inside. Important to note because anyone who sees the movie can only see it once, and gets a stamped ticket at the time to prove it. The movie, The Wizard of Monami, follows Monokuma as he meets some strange characters, a scarecrow who hangs herself, a Monami lion who is pinned up by arrows, and a tin Monami who he disassembles. So a hanging and a pinning, but no disassembling. Well, yeah, Monokuma did confirm, as with the last game, that there's a rule against one culprit killing more than two victims. Furthermore, though Sayonji is tied up, her cause of death was seemingly having her throat slit, not from arrows. More and more, this seems a bit haphazard. At the hospital, we discover a conference room which is pitch black because of a light-blocking curtain inside of it. It also has different flooring from the rest of the hospital, and the curtain itself seems to be like the one found in the music venue. At the motel, we visit Sayonji's room and discover that according to Sonia, she thinks she might have inadvertently gotten Sayonji killed, because the reason she actually wouldn't come out, which Sonia got a peek of, was that she bathed and struggled to put on her kimono the way Koizumi showed her. Giving friendly advice, Sonia noted the full-body mirror at the music venue, meaning that she might have gone there at some point because of that advice. With all that said, our investigation is over, so we head on over to Monokuma Rock as usual to get the trial underway. As with last time, since I didn't really care for this trial as much and also found it somewhat convoluted, I'm gonna kinda speed by this one. One thing I should note, though, is that this one even fails for me gameplay-wise, because it arguably has the most Hangman's Gambit sections in a trial, and god, they suck, I hate them. Basically, though, what happened was this. The culprit actually staged the hanging video in the conference room by stealing the camera from the music venue and using the similar backdrop to fool Hinata. In reality, the culprit killed Miyota the previous night at the music venue and used the AC to throw off the time of death. In the middle of the process of doing that was when Saionji came along, and so eager to cover their tracks once walked in on, they killed Saionji on the spot, which was unplanned. To account for this, they tied her body up on the baton and covered it with wallpaper, therefore making it seem like only one body was there when Hinata first arrived. This is also how blood got on Miyota's feet and on the stepladder, as she actually walked through the blood while having a bag over her head. So, after Hinata first arrived, the culprit slipped in behind him after he ran out. Then they uncovered it to make it look like she'd been killed right after. Broke the camera to mix in with the already broken transceiver, and glued the door shut, placing a broken drumstick nearby to make it falsely seem as though it were blocked off from the inside instead of the outside. They then joined the group and broke the door down, corroborating all of these false details. Who could have done it? Well, none other than Mikan Tsumiki, of course, who, to her credit, almost throws everyone off her trail in the trial by playing up her demure bully victim traits to the max to get everyone pissed at Hinata for suspecting her. In fact, I'd say one of the most genuinely compelling aspects of the trial itself is this dynamic, because we know, especially if we've done her free time events, that Tsumiki has suffered some legitimately horrible bullying and abuse, and that's part of why I despise the way her character is handled, because much of her bullying was sexual in nature, and hypersexuality, seeking attention of that kind in response to that kind of trauma, that's real. That happens. And the fact that it's played up for fan service jokes is just deeply screwed up and tone deaf. But regardless, the camaraderie I was mentioning about the group is really tested here, as communication breaks down and the truth is almost not reached because everyone is so desperate for Hinata to stop talking about the inconvenient truth that leads them to suspect their friend. But Hinata correctly responds that it's because he wants to believe in his friends that he needs to expose the truth, no matter what it is. This borders on compelling, like I said, but what ruins it is what we ultimately find out Tsumiki's motive to be. Turns out she contracted despair disease, what a shocker, and it gave her her memories back. The school memories she lost somehow turned her into someone who was in love with despair, and claims all of this was an act of reciprocation to an unseen beloved of hers, who apparently accepted who she was no matter what, loving every part of herself she found ugly and calling everyone else sad by virtue of only accepting the ghost of her past self while rejecting her current self. While I find all of this somewhat interesting in theory, it still makes for an ultimately pretty unsatisfying conclusion to the case itself because we can't really follow that motive at all. It just ends up feeling somewhat contrived because unlike any other case, we really don't get answers for much of anything by the end. And Tsumiki herself effectively just gets replaced with an entirely different character at the last second, who exists solely to be a crazy culprit, allowing us no kind of tragic attachment to the character who came before this, who we actually knew. There's the fear looming over how getting her memories back could have changed Tsumiki so much and whether it would have a similar effect on everyone else, and she also drops hints about the supposed Future Foundation, whose logo was emblazoned on the door to the ruins, being one and the same with World Ender, but that's about it. She's promptly escorted off to her extremely underwhelming execution, which is lurid and obnoxiously over-sexualized because they just can't help themselves with how they portray this poor girl, and she rockets off into space without us even seeing what happens to her at all. After the trial, everyone gathers at the beach after being told they can see Nidai again, and promptly realizes he's been totally reborn as a strange robot due to how excessive his injuries were, ending Chapter 3. This chapter had a strong start, a decent mystery, if a bit bloated, but ultimately fell apart when it comes to one of the most important aspects of a Danganronpa case, its narrative and its motive. The motive is one of the biggest things that makes a case shine, and ultimately informs how tragic it can be. Which they got so right in Case 2 that I'm surprised they could so drastically drop the ball here. Tsumiki's motives hint at future developments to come, sure, but isolated, it's effectively nothing. It's just, oh, she went crazy, and that's about all. And that makes solving the mystery ultimately end up feeling very hollow and pointless because there's very little satisfying narrative payoff to coincide with it. We lost one of the best characters in the cast and another who had a lot of untapped potential, and it was ultimately in service of one of the most underwhelming cases in the entire series, which is honestly a crying shame. The thematic exploration of trust and togetherness here was something interesting, and that's about all I could really find nice to say about the trial itself. And it certainly wasn't helped by the frankly insultingly bad execution sequence, which just takes the piss in a million different frustrating ways. I'm glad things only go uphill again from here, because this is the kind of chapter that makes you almost lose faith in a game, and I'm glad I don't have to touch it again after this. So, Nidai is a robot. That's a thing. Surprisingly enough, though, this development doesn't really change much in terms of what we've got to do now. Everybody's still worrying about the whole Future Foundation name drop that Tsumiki gave, and the implication of a traitor to the group that goes along with it. And again, the actual tangible camaraderie of everyone is tested, and seeds are planted for doubt once again when Komaeda posits that Hinata himself may even be the traitor without knowing it, since he's the only person who can't remember his talent, tapping pretty clearly into his anxieties about the subject that we've been grappling with for a while. Enough about that, though. We've got a new island to explore, one that looks like a big old creepy Disneyland. Complete with a little former hut for Monomi before it was taken over by Monokuma, a sealed castle apparently full of mice which scares the mascots away from it, preventing them from accessing it. Don't ask about the name, I promise I don't know anything. A roller coaster, which everyone gets at least a little bit of fun out of, and oh yeah, the prize for that is actually a document about the killing school life. Wait, hold the phone, huh? As in the events from DR1? Yes indeed, complete with screenshots. It basically sums up the whole thing, and of course it gets a lot of people speculating when they see Togami listed as one of its survivors. So what's our last stop here? Well, none other than a nice little funhouse, isn't that great? Well, it would be if Monokuma didn't gas everyone to sleep and trap them inside of it. Yeah, we can't have nice things around here, can we? As colorful and fun as the supposed strawberry house seems, it's not much in the way of food. Really, its only interesting fixture seems to be this creepy clown door called the Final Dead Room, which Monokuma claims houses the ultimate weapon, a prize attainable only through winning a life or death game inside, which isn't exactly the most exciting proposal. Well, there's a tower that intersects with the supposed grape house that can be traveled across to with an elevator, maybe in there. Well, it has a statue of Sakura from Danganronpa 1, a similar intersecting side of the tower, more dorm rooms, and a Monokuma museum. There's also a curious portrait in the lounge of each house, supposedly of an older man, the founder of Hope's Peak Academy. Izuru Kamakura? Hold up, that name sounds familiar, but it seems a bit mismatched. Zero told us that Izuru Kamakura was a human experiment for the sake of Hope being worked on by Hope's Peak, which ultimately went rogue under the influence of Junko and apparently killed a whole bunch of people. So what's the deal with this? No telling yet, but it's something to keep in mind. You know what else is curious about this place? The lack of food, and that's where you probably start to get the hint. Yes, indeed, the motive this time's as simple as it gets. You either starve while trapped in the funhouse or kill somebody to get out of it. Them's the breaks. Monokuma certainly doesn't make things much easier in that regard either, as he has everyone divvy up between 3 types of dorm rooms, a deluxe kind with soundproofing, a regular quality kind, and an absolutely dreadful drafty kind. Furthermore, he also continually gathers everyone absurdly early for rounds of Monokuma Tai Chi, basically some daily exercise to stress their starvation to its absolute limits. This is a ticking time bomb just waiting to lead to a quick murder, and as tension between the group rises, especially with Soda beginning to suspect Hinata as the traitor more and more, it's easy to see where all of this is headed. At least Robot Nidai alleviates some of this when I spend time with him. They don't call him the best coach for nothing, really. His whole thing is that he's so supportive and tuned into people's talents that he's a perfect source of encouragement, and he helps people cultivate what they're best at by both lending his positivity and helping them structure their routines around what will further build up those individual strengths. This is a terrible situation, but I really love having him on my side through all of the— oh my god! Sorry, I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself. I did need to mention both that Hinata got so hungry once that he tried to approach the Final Dead Room to find an exit and was stopped by a lone Nanami, which, god, the game really hits home how deliriously tired and hungry he's getting by literally slowing the pace at which you're able to move in the POV mode, a deliciously cruel bit of immersion, and the fact that during the night he heard a huge slamming sound but was too tired to just get up and check on it. Guess we have an idea of what that was now, huh? Yes, indeed, we only just got him back, but it already seems like Nekomaru Nidai is dead, for real this time, and that sucks. It really sucks. I liked him a lot, but also this was one of the most high-stress and unavoidable situations that the island has presented us with yet, and it makes that, once again, disruption of the group's harmony all the more heartbreaking, because it really makes you just feel the powerlessness involved. Whoever did this may not have even necessarily wanted to, but what other option is there? Let everyone starve? Then they'd all just die. And that's certainly not going to work out. But doing the opposite means shattering that togetherness and taking another friend away, so it's just a no-win situation. That's something that's so deliberately cruel about everything Monokuma posits to the characters in these games, that even when it's an ostensibly simple scenario, becomes such a fascinating incubator for the worst human impulses, driven and pressured by things we can ultimately see ourselves succumbing just as easily to. It's a lot to take in. So what's to gather from this gruesome scene? Well, firstly, food, darkly enough. True to his word, Monokuma gives everyone a bit of grub to make sure they don't keel over themselves during the investigation. And with that in our systems, we can finally get to work scouring for clues. There's a hammer nearby, which seems pretty self-explanatory, but it's a bit clean for what it was seemingly used for. Also, his entire body is pretty beaten up, with the wire wrapped around him as well, which is a bit mysterious if they only bludgeoned him to death. Protruding from the coach's neck is a switch he mentioned earlier that puts him into sleep mode, only broken by his alarm clock system planted in his chest. The wire tied around him is also tied in some kind of loop that's too small to be used as a noose, but clearly there for something. Furthermore, there are chains on the seeming door to the strawberry house, and a large pillar has fallen beside him, which has blood-like oil drenched on it. Some fragments are underneath his body too, with hardly any on top of it. Returning to the lounge, we've got a call from Strawberry House. Apparently the guys over there can't get here because the elevator is busted, and the door to the tower has also been sabotaged. This means we'll have to wait for Soda to fix stuff for everyone to get over, and in order to investigate Strawberry House properly, we'll have to take control of somebody else. That's right, for the first time we're playing as someone other than our main protagonist, and it's actually Komaeda. Here we find out that sometime in the middle of the night, there was a huge commotion around a ringing clock in the Strawberry House lounge, which anyone not in a soundproof room rushed out to see. Kuzuryu was already sitting in the lounge when it happened because he was restless, so he got to it first, and was shortly followed by Soda and Tanaka. He had even seen Nidai going somewhere shortly before this, and this was evidently very early in the morning. While Soda gets to work repairing stuff, Komaeda asks him if he wouldn't mind carrying a compass with him on it and seeing how it reacts. With that demand out of the way, he heads fearlessly into the final dead room, reckoning that his luck should help him succeed and find out its secrets. What ensues is a skippable escape room-esque minigame similar to Zero Escape, which you have to solve puzzles to reach the end of. It's pretty fun to play if you actually give it a shot, but admittedly it does take quite a bit of creative thinking, and the Saw-like room design definitely gives off a fittingly eerie vibe. Upon solving everything, the last challenge to get behind the last locked door is a rousing round of Russian roulette where the danger level informs the prize winnings. Seeing as he's called the lucky student for something, Komaeda decides not to wager his life against one bullet loaded in the chambers, but all chambers loaded except for one. Succeeding predictably, his horrifying luck is even feared by the ever-encouraging Monami, and he heads into the aptly named Octagon. Inside are a bunch of weapons, but what's the ultimate weapon? Before we can find that out, Monokuma gives Komaeda a spicy file full of information for his efforts. Apparently full of student files on the gang, though we as players won't be privy to this information ourselves for a while longer. As Komaeda looks around, he observes that this room both has a floor hatch leading somewhere in particular, and seemingly only one window in the building. When he looks out it, he's surprised by something, and we then cut back to Hinata and Nanami in the Grape House lounge. Just as we're trying to get our bearings back, Komaeda suddenly appears in Grape House, in case we were too tantalized by the prospect of where the floor hatch went to wait any longer. But that's funny. How does the floor hatch go from Grape House to the Octagon? Before we can ask ourselves that, though, we have to ask ourselves this one more time. What is Hinata's talent? Finally, it seems this matter will be elucidated for us, as Komaeda claims the file he received only contains Hinata's information. That information clarifying that he was a student from the Reserve Department, a talentless nobody who only got in on money. This would seemingly explain why Komaeda is suddenly being so cold to him, but then again, he seems to be acting cold toward everyone, and just a lack of talent doesn't seem worth being so hostile over, right? He's definitely hiding something, but even with that aside, this is something of a gut punch for Hinata, and understandably so. For that matter, if he's from the Reserve Corps, why is he the only person among this group for whom that seems to be the case? Aside from that, though, Komaeda also clarifies that he's learned even more thorough details about the first game's events, and draws direct attention to the parallels between the murders that have happened on the island thus far, and the ones that happened in the prior game, making certain to mention that the fourth case in DR1 was ruled a suicide, wondering aloud if that fact has any bearing on the current case. Definitely worth considering. Leaving us only with the hint that nowhere in the Octagon did he find a weapon worthy of being called the ultimate weapon, Komaeda departs, and we're back on the beat. Seems Soda's fixed the elevator, and as requested, he took the compass with him, claiming the needle must have been broken because it spun 180 degrees while he was inside. Carefully disassembling Nidai's plating, Soda also finds that the internal clock is broken at 7:30, which obviously conflicts with the early hours of around 5 that people claim to see him and hear noises around. After fixing the borked Strawberry House door, everyone is shocked to see not only that a chain seemingly didn't prevent them from entering, but also that the scene of the crime is exactly the same as viewed before, not having switched perspectives at all, which should be impossible if the towers meet in the middle. There's also a broken doorknob wrenched off of the Grape House door mixed into the scene of the crime for some reason. And with that all gathered, we're done investigating this twisted crime, and fittingly for a case that defies explanation, something else surprising emerges in the form of Monokuma Rock basically just jettisoning through the floor of the tower to take everyone to the trial ground. But this many surprises in such a short time is comfortably enough. Perhaps we should get to work actually unraveling some of them before we get any more. Thus, the fourth trial is afoot. Let me go ahead and say off the bat that, like the last case, I'm probably going to go a little brief with these next couple in terms of actual summarization. However, this isn't because I actually think they're bad cases at all. In fact, I think they're really good ones, barring some small nitpicks. But what you do need to understand is that this trial, for example, is 2.5 hours long, compared to DR1's still meaty but much less dragged out trials, and this is part of what makes scripting something about this game so comparatively difficult, and part of why I think this game's pacing does suffer a bit compared to its predecessor. Obviously, it does have more to account for in terms of scale especially, but I feel like a lot of fat could have been trimmed while still achieving that, and that they maybe didn't do quite enough of that. So the first matter of business is what killed Nidai. Initial suspicion points to the hammer, but given how clean it is, this is quickly ruled out in favor of a much more blood-soaked fixture, the pillar. But how'd a pillar kill Nidai? It certainly couldn't have been swung around given its size and heft. Before we can figure that out, we need to figure out the secret of the funhouse itself, because as Komaeda's teleporting trick so elegantly demonstrated to us, there's a need to get our heads wrapped around the structure of this building. Komaeda helps with this by finally revealing what he saw outside the Octagon window, a view that tells a lot just by seeing it. Yes, it turns out that there's no two buildings that meet in the middle, but in fact one large building with both houses stacked onto each other. Furthermore, the tower is a giant elevator shaft whose floor moves between the top and bottom layers when its entrance is activated, switching between Grape and Strawberry House, and explaining why the layout of the crime didn't change between houses, since both layers have their corresponding doors to keep up the illusion. That's also why the chain on one door did nothing to prevent it from being opened, as it was technically an entirely different door being opened. The trick was to keep up the illusion of the funhouse itself to distract from how this building structure was exploited for the crime. The reason then why Soda's compass spun in the elevator is because it swivels around the building to again create the illusion of two separate buildings located across from each other. In clearing the final dead room, seeing out the window, and understanding the nature of the funhouse, Komaeda argues the funhouse itself is the ultimate weapon, and given that there's a hatch that leads between two houses there which anyone who clears the final dead room can use at their leisure, it's safe to assume that the culprit cleared it and used it to their advantage, seeing as the hammer found at the scene of the crime also could not have come from anywhere else but the room with a bunch of weapons stored in it. So how'd they use the building to their advantage? Well, they got Nidai in sleep mode, tied him with a wire to the doorknob of the Grape door, shifted the elevator down, and then set his alarm for a certain time where he'd awaken, freak out, and fall, which ultimately led to him colliding with the pillar, but would have basically killed him either way. The proof of this lies in the doorknob that unexpectedly came completely off due to Nidai's weight all resting on it. Of course, now the time discrepancy comes up, as Nidai's time of death was evidently 7:30. How do we account for this? Simple. Nidai's internal alarm was set for Monokuma Tai-Chi, and he went right on time. The culprit therefore messed with all the clocks in the building between both houses, so that everyone else would assume that it was earlier than it actually was. The culprit then messed with Nidai's internal alarm system after putting him into sleep mode during their confrontation, because they successfully got him alone. That's why there was a rumbling sound in what seemed like the middle of the night, because it was actually around morning time and everyone was so exhausted that they basically couldn't tell. Around the same time is when the alarm clock in the lounge went off, and though everyone briefly questions why Komaeda never came out, it's made clear that he was in a deluxe room that had soundproof walls. However, this points to a big mistake made by the killer, and remembering who took what rooms, it becomes sadly clear. Among that crowd that gathered around the ringing clock was none other than Gundam Tanaka, who also slept in a deluxe room, meaning there's no way he should have been able to hear it if he was sleeping there as he claims. The plan was obviously to use this alarm to establish an alibi for when everyone heard the slamming noise, but given that the culprit would have had to set all of this up in advance and confront Nidai to do so, getting back into their room would have been impossible if, say, they couldn't get past Kazuryu, who was in the lounge, without being spotted. Therefore, they were outside of their room when the alarm rang, and with no other choice had to join the group to avoid further suspicion. Though Tanaka briefly tries to argue that the broken contact elevator would have prevented him from coming back should he have been the killer, this is disproven yet again by way of the final dead room, as if Tanaka cleared it, he would have had to use the hatch that Komaeda was able to utilize similarly during their investigation. The chain and hammer found at the scene too, as mentioned before, could only have come from there. However, Tanaka still objects fiercely when the idea of him pulling one over on Nidai comes up, clearly having respected the man enough not to want his final memory tarnished, and goads us to go further to figure out what the truth of the matter was, which turns out to be that his sleep switch was successfully pressed by Tanaka's trusty hamsters. As it all comes to light, the sequence of events is clear, and soon after, the motivation behind the crime is made clear as well. Having discovered the funhouse's secret, Tanaka challenged Nidai in one last bid to see which one of them would survive, knowing that if nothing happened, everyone would simply starve and die anyway. To break this stalemate, he challenged Nidai head-on, knowing that one of them would most certainly die, and Nidai, wanting his friends to live as well, fully accepted such a challenge, promising not to hold anything back. Clearly, Tanaka became the victor, and he did what he could to provide a worthy challenge for his remaining friends, but in doing so, he did what he thought was appropriate, to try desperately as possible to live, instead of lying down and dying. Earlier in the chapter, when Hinata almost concedes to his despair, he claims that he would rather starve to death in the funhouse than allow anyone to die again. And in these final moments of his life, Tanaka challenges this sort of sacrificial notion with a notion of his own.
What's the point of living if you're just waiting until you finally die? There's nothing courageous about that. That is abandonment, a mere feeling of resignation. Ever since we were locked inside that building, everyone had been dominated by that feeling of abandonment. However, nothing is born from resignation. That is simply a reason to give up. Giving up on life, that's an insult to life itself. Have you fools heard the term dog eat dog? In zoology, cannibalism is a commonly observed phenomenon. Many creatures, at some point in their lifespan, engage in cannibalism. That is what it means to live. If you say killing for the sake of living is evil, then what would you call giving up on life itself? If a world would consider that justice, then I will fight that world with every last fiber of my being.
And it's this sentiment, with which Nidai himself agreed, that led to this agreed-upon duel, for the sake of everyone, not just themselves. Of course, Tanaka pursued his own life too, posing that challenge similarly to his friends. But it was not an action born of pure evil, despite how his theatrics may at times imply otherwise. After all, we have to remember too how easily he admitted to his crime after being cornered. But of course, when asked by Hinata if he was actually sacrificing himself for their sake, he composes himself. He puts on a final air of unshakable bravado, becoming the Gundam Tanaka that everyone expects him to be.
I can't believe you would ask such a foolish question. Just who do you think I am? I am Gundam Tanaka, history's greatest monster!
Embracing his punishment as a natural step, nigh demanding that everyone trample over him to live on, to survive yet another tragedy, Gundam soothes his animal companions, soon to be without him.
In this world, I am only a temporary visitor,
He says.
I was simply visiting for a moment. And now that my duty is complete, I must return to the darkness.
Promising to fill hell with true hell, Gundam is faced with a stampede of animals commanded by Monokuma. He even tries briefly to subvert his own execution by way of some ancient dark magic. However, as it obviously is just another Chunibyoism of his, it doesn't work, and the impact of the animal's brute strength slamming into him renders him limp and bloodied on the sand. In that moment, despite his insistence that he was pure evil, a creature of the shadows to be feared and to be dragged to hell, his heart is looked upon in favor for what it truly is. This boy, who so fiercely valued life that he would sacrifice himself for his friends, like another brave soul before him, is swept around by the warmth and light of actual angelic spirits, animals much like the ones he would regularly take care of, ensuring that they too would live on. Because as convincing a face of evil he could wear in the end, that exterior was shed by the enormity of his heart for all to see. Gundam Tanaka valued life. He treasured and nurtured it. And even as his own extinguished, he was cared for by the very creatures he gave so much of that life for, and carried, fittingly, into the heavens he was so sure he could have never belonged to. As even somewhat silly as this execution appears on the surface, it truly does destroy me every time, because I am always so struck by how distinctly, genuinely poignant it is.
We shouldn't just stand here,
Says Hinata.
stand up and walk. Move forward. Live. If you don't, everyone who fought and died will have died in vain.
And with that sentiment, we return to the island. But of course, this isn't over yet, as we not only learn that Komaeda kept secret that the files reported on everyone, but we even see him go to conversate secretly with Monokuma. What about? Well, apparently this file has 16 students listed, the actual amount we had at the start. But if someone was a plant, a traitor, there shouldn't have been a page for them, right? At which point Monokuma confirms he slipped a fake page in to prevent the traitor's identity from being immediately sussed out, meaning he knows who it is. They talk for a bit before Komaeda decides he wants to become the ultimate stepladder, and thus the super high school level hope, prompting Monokuma to say he reminds him of someone else, who we can probably guess. Though Komaeda is unfamiliar, he asks one last question, that being if Monokuma is waiting for somebody on this island, and if so, whether they're already here. Monokuma simply responds that if so, wouldn't that be exciting? The timer in Jabberwock Park once again counts down, and Chapter 4 ends. This chapter is honestly excellent. The Octagon stuff can get a little BS in the trial, and I'm not fond of the Hangman's Gambit sections as usual, but everything else hits superbly well. The tone of the chapter is so sickly and dour, it's palpable. You feel the dread, and therefore Tanaka's sacrifice is that much more hard-hitting and thematically in line with everything leading up to it. The murder method is inventive and honestly pretty fun to figure out, and the chapter's conclusion is absolutely worthy of its bombast, genuinely making me almost as emotional as Sakura's sacrifice from DR1 did, even if perhaps not hitting quite the same emotional high. The message going forward from this is fittingly poignant, and is convincingly enough to really kick our cast into overdrive, leading into the game's climax. But oh boy, if you thought the Chapter 5 swerve of DR1 was high octane, you haven't seen anything yet. So, Chapter 5 is here, and before we can do our usual routine of investigating the new island, we first have to acknowledge one of Soda's best gestures in this plot. Seems he took some of Need-Eye's materials and made a mini Need-Eye toy. It doesn't have much of an actual sentience, and it's definitely not Need-Eye himself, but it can respond with various Need-Eye-like phrases, and it's clearly an attempt to cheer everyone, especially Owari, up after losing him. It's really sweet. Recalling the way Komaeda's tone changed so drastically toward Hinata, he reluctantly pulls everyone in to tell them about his reserve corps status. Of course, once he does, they only sigh in relief that it wasn't something actually horrible worth telling, and respond that it doesn't matter if Hinata is part of the main course or not, because either way, he's their treasured friend. It really sells the chemistry built between this cast and main character that we've been observing this whole time, and I find this scene, even if it's short, really charming because of that. So, last island time now, and boy, what a doozy it is.
The Citadel's on full alert. I've never seen it lit up like that.
We've got abandoned street vendors filled with food, but with nobody around to eat or to serve. We've got a factory with Monokuma's face on it, which is producing an endless supply of Monokuma plush dolls, and its warehouse with plenty more Monokuma merch to be found, which, when Monomi asks why there's no merch of her, earns her a good old-fashioned Jotaro Kujo beatdown. There's a military base with tanks, cars, and even the helicopter used in Hanamura's execution, and actually, we've got to stop here for a second because guess what Sonia found in one of the trucks? Yeah, a document outlining a development plan for Jabberwock Island by the Future Foundation. In it, it details a plan to turn Jabberwock Island into a central headquarters for them, citing that the travel agency that managed the island initially had gone bankrupt, leaving it uninhabited, which meant that the island was, quote, unaffected by the incident. What do these words mean, though? Well, to our cast, they have no idea, but us, we may have a few ideas by this point. No time for dawdling, though, we've got to complete our search. Over at Sea King Industries, we find a facility dabbling in robotics, one that is seemingly putting together the mono beasts that were guarding each island gate. Apparently, according to Soda, Sea King Industries was a real company making machinery parts, but they never made anything like this, so it has to have been taken over somehow. Soda also notes that he snooped around on a computer here looking for clues and came across some embarrassing emails that must have been sent from somebody sending his amateur manga concept to a friend. When asked about what that concept was, he elaborates that it entailed global riots caused by high school students, which he calls totally unrealistic. Apparently, the riots grew and grew as more and more people became frustrated with society, until eventually it spread like an infectious disease on a worldwide scale, smothering the world in anxiety as apocalypse creeps closer. Though he's pretty sure that this is all fake, Hinata asks if it's really okay to dismiss it so readily, and Soda responds that it's even more unrealistic than a notebook that kills people just by writing in it, which, dang, they really upped their anime references this time, huh? He then theorizes that a bunch of perverted rich guys who love watching people kill each other are the ones behind all this, basically predicting Squid Game a full 9 or so years before it came out. Are we sure Soda isn't the fortune teller? Returning to the vendors for a powwow, we're unexpectedly joined by Komaeda, who everyone had lost track of until now. He says he's been looking around for someone who he thought might have already arrived, but must not have. He says that he expects this person to be the survivor of the killing school life, but says that he can wait until he figures out the identity of the traitor, something he claims he'll deduce even if it costs him his life. Of course, by this point, nobody wants to believe a traitor could exist among the group, but it feels just like Komaeda to demand everyone turn their attention to what might be an inconvenient or despair-filled truth and overcome it. Of course, he seems a little out of it to still be doing that whole shtick, even claiming to want to wipe out all the despair on the island himself, too. Something has definitely changed about him since he got that file back in the Octagon, whatever it was. Anxious about Komaeda's continued actions, everyone meets in the morning to discuss the idea of ambushing and tying him up again. And although Hinata is anxious about the entire thing, it doesn't seem like everybody has much choice but to go along with it, considering how much of a rogue element Komaeda has become. Before we do that, though, we have some time to spend, and Sonia wants us to come along to the previously discovered ancient ruin with her during that time. Why? Because she's thinking about the document we found at the military base and long ago at the library, wondering if perhaps the plans for the administrative building changed last second, and it was made somewhere other than Jabberwock Park. Looking there for clues, they see the keypad guarding the door, but are still put off of trying it by the machine gun attached to it. They speculate briefly about whether an explosive could bring the door down, but decide that it seems too sturdy. Going back, we have more free time until later when Komaeda suddenly shows up in our room at night. So why is he here? Well, he's been invited to the lobby by Nanami as per the plan, and already suspects something will go down. By positing this theory to Hinata and reading his expression, he's already sure he's right, but decides to go anyway, basically teasing that he wants Hinata to come along so he isn't left out, claiming that when they first came here, they were friends who investigated together, but now their relationship has changed. It's honestly a little bit sad, or, well, it would be if what happened next didn't immediately follow it. So what does happen? Well, of course, Komaeda is set upon by everyone lying in wait, but before they can tie him up, he chastises them for yet again acting short-sightedly, claiming that this is the beginning of the end as a small bomb sets off in the lobby, reducing it to a near smoldering crater. Laughing maniacally, Komaeda elaborates on his intentions. He's hidden several bombs, with even more destructive force around the island. If they go off in 2 days at noon, they're sure to cause destruction so grievous that not only will nobody survive, but the entire island will sink into the sea. Only he knows where they are, so the only way to stop him would be for him to willingly turn them off, and he'll only do so if the traitor comes forward. Hinata pleads to Monokuma to stop him because of the rule against killing more than 2 people at one time, but Monokuma simply responds that Komaeda hasn't killed anyone yet, and therefore can't be held accountable for simply saying he's going to break the rules before he's actually done so. Thanks, buddy, you're a lot of help. So what in the world do we do? Obviously, we have to investigate and see if we can find these things, right? Well, Komaida's actually going to give us a bit of a hint at breakfast first, and it's actually a big one. He says the bombs are somewhere the gang hasn't been before, which narrows things down significantly, but does present a problem. Namely, the problem of how we get there. Well, Nanami is quick to point out that Komaida would probably have trouble getting into the ancient ruin as well, so the only other place they haven't been inside would be Nezumi Castle on the 4th island. Heading there, it seems the entrance has been blown to bits already, and inside the ornate-seeming chapel there's decorative spears, a plaque, but no bombs. On the floor plaque, there's also a message. To all subjects, the password to guide everyone to the future is... And the answer is scratched out, beyond illegible. Seems somebody got here before us, realized that this could get us somewhere, and made sure we wouldn't be able to find out. And so, one day passes. In the morning, Owari is strangling Komaida. Though we can definitely understand where she's coming from, she's definitely dipping right back into murderous territory, and Nanami slaps her back to her senses, saying that she's not the kind of person who would hurt someone. This borders on somewhat bittersweet, but the moment is hilariously interrupted as Komaida staggers to his feet and thanks Owari for giving him the brief opportunity to see his dead dog again. Guess he was pretty close to following the light there. Everyone interrogates Komaida about the ruin password, to which he admits the bombs were definitely there. Until yesterday, when he moved them. He said nothing interesting was inside the ruin itself either, just some familiar scenery. This time, the hint is somewhere that everyone's been at least once, which, while broad, means that they have a better chance of finding the bombs if they spread out. While we search around, we finally go inside Monami's hut, at which point she admits she had a special chest in here that was stolen by somebody recently. Eventually, though, Kazuryu comes running to us. Apparently, he found them. They're in the plushie factory on the final island, and he tells everyone to haul over to meet and discuss the situation. We go to the central island to retrieve Sonia, who should be searching there, but only Monokuma is there, claiming Sonia went off to the military base. There, she says that there's something she needed to confirm here, which is why she wasn't where she was expected to be. Hinata tells her about the bombs being discovered, but she still insists on staying behind for a bit and catching up, at which point he reluctantly leaves her behind. At the factory, the bombs are rigged to a large truck, set to go off when the engine is killed. The wires go to a keycard reader, apparently only able to be disabled if the trader's handbook is scanned. This is all confirmed via a video message left on the nearby laptop by Komaida, who claims that he found out the trader's identity by observing everyone for a while, but still wants them to out themselves. Everyone worries back and forth about whether they should scan everyone's handbooks to be safe or if the wrong one would make it explode, but Nanami says this is all stupid and swipes hers without a second thought. Nothing happens, but the fuel is running out fast and everyone is beginning to panic. Suddenly, Sonia arrives, and she has a big announcement. These are not bombs. It does blow, but it turns out they're all just fireworks. The video message resumes, and Komaida admits the whole plan was a bluff, that there were never really any bombs powerful enough to sink the island, and that he got the only one he actually had back at the Octagon. Claiming to want one last comparing of answers on the trader's identity, Komaida claims he'll be at the warehouse next door, which everyone heads to. Hearing strange music beyond the door, Owari tries to open it, but feels something blocking it from the other side. Kicking it hard, the door opens, but inside, it's dark. Suddenly, a fire starts, and everyone rushes to get the extinguishing supplies in the warehouse break room. Fire grenades that they should be able to throw onto the fire. Rushing back with them, everyone throws them onto the fire, but it doesn't seem to do anything. Just at that moment, though, the sprinklers activate, killing the fire. Monokuma shows up to mourn his merge, but also tells everyone to stay out for a bit while the smoke airs out. When they're finally able to enter, they notice that the curtain at the back, which was burnt up, was actually concealing more space. And when they walk toward it, they finally see what had been filling them with such anxiety. Yes, Nagito Komaida is indeed waiting there for them. But not as they expected. He's dead. This gruesome torture scene seems almost unbelievable, like it could never be the handiwork of someone here no matter how angry they were. And as off the deep end as Komaida's gotten this whole time, it's hard to even take any kind of relief in this situation because, well, what a horrible way to die, even so. This is where I have to finally come clean about the second character whose free time events I completed. Yep, that's right, Komaida himself. One of the most easily misunderstood characters in this entire series to me, and I'll be honest, I think the localization has a hand in this. Absolutely no offense meant to Bryce Papenbrook, who plays Komaida in the English dub, But I do find that compared to his original portrayal by Megumi Ogata, something was changed about Komaida's tone, something I can only really chalk up to what Bryce was directed to do. Unfortunately, I don't really think it fits. Komaida's attitude is one that is often soft-spoken and eerie, but also legibly sincere despite all the wild things he says. You get the distinct impression that he means everything he says to some degree or another. And by contrast, his English dialogue seems almost eternally sarcastic, a sort of pompous edge to it that makes him seem much less earnest than he should. This is further added to by his free time events, where you can finally start to unravel some of his character traits, his outlook, and what all of this means to him. He defines hope as absolute good, something that if it can propagate, he'd gladly sacrifice everything for its sake. He views his talent as extremely boring, but the reason he always factors it in as a stepping stone for hope is because of how it's always worked for him during his entire life. You see, for Komaida, it sort of works like this. The worse bad luck he experiences at first, the better the good luck that comes afterward. Good luck to him is an absolute power that can be wielded. When he was in elementary school, he was on a plane with his family, but it was hijacked. Bad luck. But at the exact same time, a small meteorite fell and killed the hijackers. Good luck. But it also hit and killed Komaida's parents. Bad luck, which led to him obtaining a large inheritance and complete independence from them. Good luck. He was once kidnapped by a murderer in middle school, bad luck, but coincidentally found a winning lottery ticket in the trash bag the murderer stuffed him inside, good luck. And of course, the biggest blow of all, he's been diagnosed quite a while ago with stage 3 malignant lymphoma and frontotemporal dementia. In other words, his brain is literally deteriorating, and his life expectancy, even before he had 2 years worth of memory erased, was only between half a year to a year. Right as he was diagnosed, though, he was accepted into Hope's Peak. Viewing this as another sign of good luck, he's unbothered by the traumatic potential of the killing game because he views it, yet again, as something that is only waiting to be broken by good luck, something that will produce even greater hope. And honestly, given all of the horrible stuff he's been through, it makes sense that he'd feel this way. It's just a shame that things ever got to this point. In his final free time event with Hinata, he even begins to say something that resembles a love confession, but aborts it at the last second to say he loves Hinata's hope instead. In the localization, this isn't conveyed very well, but in the Japanese it's pretty clear, particularly in how he starts by saying that he's in love with, in the sense that the phrase is attached to a person, but then quickly backtracks on his phrasing and changes the object, leading to the sentence feeling grammatically disconnected, and a bit more clear as to what he was originally going to say. What a complicated character, right? And even to the end, he isn't going to make things much easier for us. This murder is one of the most mechanically complex yet, and the carnage on display here is enough to make you nearly want to turn your brain off on the onset. But we have a job to do, and no choice but to do it. So let's run down the clues of a horrible crime, once and for the last time. A Monokuma plush with a hole in it and some of Komaida's blood on it, the fire bombs, an oil lighter on the ground, a burned rope on Komaida's wrist, though his clothes are otherwise untouched, a slice on his bound left arm, a strange blood splatter on said hand, a spear piercing him with a weight attached to it, evidently from Nezumi Castle, a blank space on the cord where it's clean of blood, Komaida's legs that are tied up and slashed at, duct tape on Komaida's mouth, a suspicious lack of blood below said tape, a knife from the military base stabbed through Komaida's right hand, a small streak of blood on the overhead girder, Monokuma panels tipped over like dominoes leading to the curtain, and an MP3 player that was blaring the strange music from before. That's all for the warehouse, but before we can leave, we finally get some clarification on what Sonia was doing. You see, when she first explored the military base, she saw the bombs, and when Komaida announced his plan, she got suspicious and went back to see if they were there. Of course, they weren't, but she quickly deduced that they were fake because she tried to use one. Where? Well, the ancient ruined doors, of course. The plan was a failure, though, because they were just fireworks, like we already discovered a short while ago. Monomi was also there, peeking, apparently. The only reason Sonia held on to her suspicions was because of the one real bomb he used at the hotel, but obviously this was part of the bluff. At the military base, we find a survival knife like the one at the scene, which confirms where it came from. And in Nezumi Castle, we find one of the spears missing, clearly meaning the one at the crime scene came from here. Lastly, we have to visit Komaida's cottage, so what's inside? First of all, clearly there's Monomi's chest we were told about before. Inside it is a notebook, a diary about all of the events so far. While flipping through, Hinata lands on a page mentioning his attempt to enter the final dead room back in chapter 4, and... That's a bit odd. Before we can ponder this any farther, though, Monami shows up claiming the diary is hers, but Monokuma butts in to call her a liar, saying she can't even write. In the fridge, there's a bottle of Monokuma's special poison, again something he must have taken from the Octagon, which claims it is extremely dangerous when vaporized, heavier than air, broken down in minutes, and susceptible to hydrolysis. Under the bed is a gas mask, gloves, and a small piece of blue foil. On the shelf, we finally get into the secret file, meaning we can finally see the information on everyone else. It doesn't seem too enlightening, though, until we realize Togami's name isn't listed. Instead, we have somebody listed as the super high school level imposter, at which point Monokuma drops a bombshell. Turns out the Togami we thought died at the beginning was never really Togami from DR1 at all. Instead, he was a person whose very talent is pretending to be other people flawlessly, always concealed within a false identity and having none of their own. He also clarifies that yes, the Future Foundation spy was never an actual student, so the 16 profiles here contain a fake meant to throw off everyone's deductions of the traitor's identity, like he said before to Komaeda. And with that, our investigation is over. Buckle up, because this trial is going to be the most challenging yet. Initially, the discussion begins under the premise of Komaeda being tortured for information, but as is quickly pointed out, he has duct tape on his mouth, and it couldn't have been added after the torture just to silence him, because there was no blood under the duct tape, meaning it was applied at the start. And of course, you wouldn't tape somebody's mouth shut if you wanted them to talk, so then what about the fire? Well, obviously it could have been triggered by the oil lighter found at the scene. How? By placing a domino chain of Monokuma panels leading up to it and forcing everyone to knock the door down to start the chain reaction, explaining why it wouldn't budge at the start. The MP3 player blaring music would then be an auditory distraction to prevent everyone from immediately gathering that the panels were falling. As the discussion goes, it becomes more and more evident that perhaps Komaeda set all of this up himself. Of course, the gang has their reservations about believing he could tie himself up, but there's just one problem with that objection. The burned rope on Komaeda's wrist is fishy, isn't it? If the fire got all the way to that rope, why didn't it burn his clothes? Simple, it was never actually touched by the fire and was prepared beforehand to give off that illusion, meaning Komaeda had one free hand to finish the rope preparations with. He then propped the knife up in the Monokuma plush that he tore a hole in and had nearby, which he slammed his hand into when he was done. As for the spear, the strange bloodstain on his left hand indicates that he could have been gripping the cord. But in what circumstance would he be doing that, especially in how the spear ended up piercing him? Well, thinking about the thin line of blood on the girder, we can gather this. He hoisted it above himself across there, holding it in place by the cord, and then dropping it to impale himself. He then covered his own mouth with tape and created the supposed torture wounds with the knife before slamming his hand into it afterward. Before we can get into why he did this, though, we've got a bigger mystery. The Monokuma file, rather unusually, doesn't list a cause of death, meaning this is probably important to the mystery at hand. Hinata says that Komaeda's malice always defied their expectations, and that worries him, because he's slowly starting to think that setting his own murder to mislead everyone wasn't his main goal. So then, what if it was the poison that did him in? Perhaps if it was in a gaseous state and entered through Komaeda's nose, it could do the job just right. And of course, if that killed him while he was gripping the rope, then naturally he would just drop it and the spear would impale him. The reason nobody else inhaled it was because of the sprinklers, as the label clarifies it's weak to hydrolysis. But how'd he bring the poison to the scene? It wasn't with him, and no plastic or glass container could have been completely melted in such a short time because even the fire grenades didn't completely melt. So what about the fire grenades themselves? There would be no need to dispose of them because Komaeda knew everyone would be using them anyway. And we have proof he exchanged the contents of one with the poison. The aluminum seal we found under his bed along with the gas mask and gloves. This means, unfortunately, Komaeda was poisoned the moment the fire grenade in particular was thrown, and nobody knows which one it was when they threw it. One of the gang undeniably threw the poisoned grenade that killed Komaeda, but it's impossible to tell who. This is Komaeda's ultimate trap. An unresolvable murder that can never reach its proper conclusion. The whole thing was a rigmarole of building hopes, something to be gradually solved until everyone is simultaneously slapped in the face with an impossible barrier. A truly hopeless situation. But is that all there is to it? We know because we discussed his free time events how Komaeda's view of hope works. It's always something that follows that great wall of despair. So what is he hoping for beyond this challenge? He's hoping for his luck to win out. This whole time, he was trying to weed out the traitor after all, right? And there's a high likelihood his claim of finding out who they were was just another bluff. So then, what's the point here? He trusted his own luck, believing that the person who would pick up the fire grenade that did him in would be the traitor. But is there any way to know who the traitor is? Clearly not, right? Or, at least, we'd sure like that to be the case. As the discussion focuses around this, Nanami starts to say some weird stuff. Stuff like how the traitor couldn't reveal themselves even if they wanted to, because they weren't created to do that. They could only interact with everyone as a traitor, that being the nature of their existence. She then asks us to guess, to trust our judgment, and it's clear who we've got to pick, even if we so wish that it wasn't. Chiaki Nanami is the traitor, and like it or not, we even have proof. Even as Monami cries out and tries to deny that she's ever known Nanami. Hinata desperately doesn't want to prove it either, but we already knew the truth. We were just turning our eyes away. The proof lies in Monami's diary, or should I say, Nanami's diary. After all, Monami can't write, remember? And more than that, there's that entry about Hinata trying to enter the final dead room. Nanami is the only person who saw that happen. More than that, Nanami even used the card reader back at the truck first, and knew the bomb was fake because Monami could have reported what she saw Sonia do back to her. Heartbroken, everyone just can't bring themselves to believe it, but Nanami counters that they don't have to survive by doubting anyone anymore, but can survive by believing in her. She says she wanted to protect everyone by any means and was glad she was at least given that opportunity. So what then of Komaida's goal? We got pretty close to losing. We surely would have if Nanami didn't confess to save us. So then, was it really his goal to pin the one killer? Monokuma snickers nastily as he confirms what we're on track to figure out. Namely, that Komaida's plan was actually to kill everyone besides the traitor. But why is that? Well, we've still got a bit to go before we can figure that out, and why Nanami was placed into this situation in the first place, for that matter. Monami briefly tries to destroy Monokuma Chaozu style and lays with him in a crater Yamcha style. Man, this game loves its DBZ Saiyan Saga references, but it doesn't work. Monokuma now has thousands of spares from the factory line, and although they're all plush, he claims he can transfer himself into them without a hitch, creating further mystery about what he's capable of even now. There's no more time for that. It's time for the dreaded execution, and Monokuma even confirms that he plans to take out Monami at the same time. Leaving us with some final parting words as a teacher, Monami says her piece. And honestly, for as long as she's been dragged across this game's runtime, she still manages to bring a bit of a tear to my eye here.
There's no need to be a hero, she says. You don't have to force yourself just to make people acknowledge you. When you do that, you end up blaming yourself, blaming other people, and feeling jealous of everyone. But still, it doesn't have to be like that. Even if people don't acknowledge you, you just have to be someone that you can be proud of, because you yourself are your biggest supporter. If you can learn to love yourself, that love will continue to support you for the rest of your life. Waving goodbye to everyone for a final time, Nanami tells us that a shining future will always be waiting for us. She's lined up in front of a tank, Space Invaders style, and though she briefly tries to escape into the only exit in the room, leading us to wonder if perhaps this Chapter 5 execution will end up similar to the last game's. It's a cruel fake-out. She's shut behind glass, sealed by a shutter, and her fate is sealed as Tetris-style blocks are dropped around her, boxing her in until she's finally crushed by a lone red piece. Crushed by the weight of what's happened, everyone lazes around waiting for the timer in Jabberwock Park to end. In the morning, Hinata emerges from his cottage to be greeted by Nanami, who says there was more to Komaida's final message that everyone is gathering to watch in the restaurant, and Hinata seemingly doesn't react to her sudden reappearance at all. The screen in UI shifts and spasms, visual distortion invading the familiar space and making it feel ethereal and unknown, uncanny and untethered. If you go around to everyone's mailboxes here, each dead classmate gives off a distorted message, supposedly their final thoughts as they died, and it feels like being struck by the ghost of someone's memory, a final psychic shock of a decayed spirit long gone.
As we enter the restaurant, visions of everyone who has died continue to appear around us, blending into the group casually and with seemingly no resistance at all to their presence. The message remarks that Monokuma is trying to show this despair to someone, and that the key needed to enter the ruins was indeed the one found at Nezumi Castle. Komaeda scratched it out, claiming it was probably left in a place where Monokuma and Monomi can't go simply as a backup in case something went wrong. Finally, announcing the password he obscured, he drops a number that may at this point feel like a long-forgotten throwback. 11037, a number we should all remember. Closing out his message, asking to be regarded as the super high school level hope, Komaeda's final message is done, and everyone decides to head to the ruins before the countdown finally ends. The island is more distorted than it's ever looked, and inside the ruins appears to be an archaic-looking trial ground, more similar to one from the first game than from this one. As everyone stands around pondering this, they begin to slowly, mentally unravel, the world around them seemingly breaking down as the timer ends. As it rapidly spins, buzzes, and sparks, it explodes into a crescendo of light, the entire world of Jabberwock Island around it seemingly crumbling into a screen that declares, uncertainly, that the stage is clear. Ending Chapter 5. Well, that was certainly a lot, wasn't it? I'm a little torn on this chapter, admittedly. I do think there's much more to like about it than not, and the mystery, as always, is very good. It's a really good mix of complex, but also not so much so that a player couldn't be expected to intuit what they need to. I could have done without the longer Hangman's Gambit sections, but can't I always? What really conflicts me about all of this, though, is Nanami herself, admittedly. To be clear, I like Nanami, and I am made very easily verklempt, so yes, this reveal and her death really did get to me emotionally, especially seeing how everyone else, and especially Hinata, reacted to it. However, I would be remiss not to mention what I consider to be a pretty sizable flaw, and that's that Nanami overall, by the time she dies, is a pretty flat character when it comes to her actual development. She starts off virtually flawless and ends her role in the story the same way, only as an even more aggressively important sacrificial lamb who the developers obviously really want us to care for. If her talent as a gamer wasn't already enough to tip us off to the fact that she's very much a bit of pandering from the devs to the typical demographic of games like this should. And I want to be clear, I don't think Nanami is a horrible character. I really do care about her. But it's mostly in spite of how the game handles her, rather than because of it. I feel like she could have had a lot more narrative weight if she'd simply had any flaws like the rest of the characters, and gone through more organic growth with them rather than becoming beloved by all of them just because. This chapter hits really hard and does pretty excellently with what it has, but it could have been all the more gut-wrenching if they had just taken more of their time with Nanami's character, and unfortunately, I feel like they just kind of dropped the ball on that. Not the best chapter in the game, unfortunately, but it certainly does drop a lot of juicy information, and the end of it especially hooks you right back in if you're a longtime player. Things are more wild and confusing than ever, and that puts us right back in the shoes of someone frantically going from the end of DR1 Chapter 5 to its big climax. We're right back in that familiar place yet again. We've got answers to reach, and there's no better time. Let's put an end to this despair-filled island once and for all, and let's head into Chapter 0? Oh yeah, didn't think you were gonna escape one more loop being thrown your way, huh? No, you've got quite a few more loops to be put through, and this is one of them. This little prelude claims to be during the process of heading to the school trip, and is narrated by an unknown figure, somebody who claims to be loved by talent and finds everything boring. They're sitting on a ship alone, until across the room they are engaged in conversation by Komaeda.
Instantly, I saw his true character.
The mysterious person says of him.
The over-familiar attitude, the friendly smile. But under that thin skin, I could detect a foul, offensive odor, like some kind of putrid slime. In a sensible way, of course. How should I put this? It was a smell exclusive to those who were already finished.
The figure asks Komaeda for his talent, and when he says it, responds that it's boring, because even they have a talent as boring as luck. Komaeda is compelled, asking who they are, also saying it's the first time he's seen this person. The person doesn't respond to the inquiries, though, claiming that the entire world is boring, a place where people who lack talent swarm together, oppressing those who possess talent.
Even though they know they're insignificant, they don't try to acknowledge their true superiors.
They are profoundly desperate to drag them down to their level.
They claim that because of this, and the resulting deadlock, the world has stopped evolving, that they were taught by their teachers that boring people make no contributions to the world, and selection must be performed. They want to use that person, as that person used them in the past, and somehow, resting in their pocket, they have the contribution that person left them. Excitedly, Komaeda sits up, asking if he can finally see the girl he hates so much again, revealing that on his hand is a woman's hand, tied at the wrist with distinct red nails. The unknown figure questions it, and Komaeda responds that it's not his hand, so he can't move it. But even now, it hasn't rotted, becoming one with him, with his sworn enemy. As he rambles to himself about how he did it to take her power, and how he hates her, he questions himself.
Huh? Do I hate her?
He says.
Huh. That's strange.
Before he can ponder any longer, though, he looks out the window, seeing Jabberwock Island, and wondering what will happen once they get there. The figure claims they already know, but will not be able to participate in what lies ahead. Komaeda asks if he can ever see them again, to which they respond that there is no need.
After all, you are boring. Your talent, your thoughts, your entire existence is boring to me.
You really don't play along, do you?
And with that, we can finally start Chapter 6. Right after our world-shattering trip at the end of Chapter 5, we seemingly appear before a classroom door, just like at the start of the prologue. Beyond it is a familiar sight, despite it being a bit unclear why we're here. Why, yes, it's none other than Hope's Peak Academy, the setting of the previous game. Appearing on the monitor, Monokuma announces that we're in Endgame, and that everyone should gather in the gym so he can explain the process of graduation. As if by muscle memory, we return to the familiar halls that we walked seemingly so many times in DR1. Only the halls jitter and distort with visual tearing and glitches that seem to make it almost alien all over again. In the gym, everyone is waiting, ghosts of the past not included. Monokuma's command of us is simple. He needs us to look around the school to discover the last hidden secrets of the island, and the graduation exam's result will be determined based on whether by the end, we decide we want to leave the island or stay. Of course, while everyone is sure they're bound to want to leave now, we remember what happened last time and can only dread just what bizarre twists may lay in store to convince us otherwise. As we head into the halls, it seems impossible things just keep happening. As we exit from the gym and end up on the 5th floor, the school rearranging and shifting seemingly as Monokuma pleases. The halls are familiar facsimiles of grounds we've already tread, but in warping and suiting the aesthetic sensibilities of a computer with a magnet against the screen, it begins to resemble something of a writhing ghost of its former self. Hallowed hallways rife with history and nostalgia that scream behind a veneer of suffocating intangibility, as if it is literally the imprint of something that once existed, but now struggles to even try. In the dojo, we find the first of several manga for morons that Monokuma leads us tantalizingly through. The first is simple enough, purporting to be a history of Hope's Peak Academy. It gives us the usual talking points, school of privilege, government-funded, tops of their fields, yada yada yada, but it also clarifies that students are selected by the teachers, who are themselves simultaneously educators and scientists researching talent itself. The reserve course was implemented to supplement the Academy's waning funding and continue their greatest wish, to create a true genius who would become mankind's hope. Sound familiar? Then, an incident happened that triggered the tragedy. Destroyed by this incident, Hope's Peak was forced to shut down. The story continues in one of the classrooms, with a manga about the tragedy of Hope's Peak. The key player was one Izuru Kamakura, a genius, symbol of hope, and result of all of Hope's Peak's funneled resources. He was loved by talent, you could say, wielding many simultaneously, and the school protected their interests by concealing his identity, meaning that most students didn't even know he existed at all. However, that all changed when somehow Izuru was led to kill 13 of the best and brightest of Hope's Peak Student Council. The Academy, trying to cover for their interests, tried to deliberately conceal this incident, but a certain student began to work in secret to use that incident to their advantage. All of this should sound very familiar by now, right? Revealing the Academy's secret to the public, said person was able to take advantage of the rising discontent of the Reserve Corps students, launching an unprecedented uprising that would spiral into global chaos. So how does that story go? Well, we need to head to the biolab to find that out. Another manga explains the nitty-gritty. As the situation escalated, it became a thriving online community. Discontent piled upon discontent. Societal outrage melded and combined, escaping the internet entirely as it continued to spread. The goal was lost entirely in the midst of combined madness, abnormality surfacing as an unseen hand guided everything to more and more malicious ends. Killing became almost commonplace, and the population became utterly desensitized, even watching death unfold while enjoying a meal. By the time anyone realized what had happened, it was too late to stop it. This inevitability and despair cast a looming shadow over the entire world, and it was all spearheaded by a group, super high school level despair, who worked in the best interests of one Junko Enoshima, their savior. These former Hope's Peak students, seduced to her cause, used their extraordinary talents simply for the sake of continuing to spread her despair, and their ties to higher places only ensured it went to the top, unable to be stopped, as even the people with the proper power to ensure it could be were compromised. Hinata is bewildered by this. It couldn't be true, could it? But from what we remember, unfortunately, yeah, it could be true. And he's not even done being shocked, because Monokuma even reveals that all 2,357 students of the reserve department, barring him, all committed mass suicide under Junko's orders. She was just that influential. Kazuryu seems unbothered by Junko's influence, though, citing that he found a manga for morons about the first game, and how it ended with Junko's death and the survivors' escape. But should we really let our guards down just because of that? In the music room, we find out more. A plaque disclaims that the former graduates of Hope's Peak founded the Future Foundation in order to fight the results of the tragedy, and a holographic screen seems to be an email from the Future Foundation. It talks about finding a group of 15 Hope's Peak survivors yet to be acquired, and also of preparations on Jabberwock Island. More lies ahead in the office, a mysterious list of subjects naming all of our classmates from this game, as well as a newspaper clipping of Sayonji looking mysteriously older than she should. We saw her die, too, so how is this possible? How can a photo like this exist? Above the board is a picture of the founder yet again, reminding us that his name was Izuru Kamakura, and nearby another email screen reporting about the so-called remnants of despair, the remaining loyal of Junko's, who lived even after she died, apparently even led by someone keeping them active. The Foundation's priorities are clear. They must be eliminated for the sake of ending the tragedy. In the rec room, we get another email, but before that, there's also a file from Hope's Peak. Confidential information about an apparent hope cultivation plan, something meant to produce true hope through the use of their talent research initiative, and something they say must be completed no matter the cost. The email entails the successful acquisition of the 15 previously mentioned survivors, and how they've been entrusted to the survivors of the Killing School life, our survivors from DR1 if you'll recall. No new leads on the remnants of despair yet, though. In the library, we get our last important email, one of caution to one Makoto Naegi, questioning why he would protect the remnants of despair, and clarifying that the DR1 survivors are indeed members of the Future Foundation, who also were helped with recovering their memories. However, it seems now they've gone AWOL and are protecting the remnants? Why is that? This all sits strange, and the distorting world around us, the method of this information being presented to us, it all just spells out something fishy. And we finally find out what that is in the laundry room. A top-secret program created by the Future Foundation, the Neo World Program, meant to be used as a psychotherapeutic tool to put its subjects into a completely virtual world by mounting a device on their cranium, effectively replacing traumatic memories with memories made in the virtual world. Understandably collapsing under the weight of the realization he's having, Hinata breaks down, barreling down a hall which is made entirely of code. In it, we get a truly haunting exchange with Sonia, who asks if Hinata knows about the placebo effect and nocebo effect, with the former describing a health improvement after taking a fake medicine you believe is real, and the latter being the exact opposite. If the brain believes something is real, then it becomes real. And when asked why she's bringing it up, she suddenly can't remember. In a classroom, we find a floating monolithic pillar surrounded by code, and swallowed in grayscale. When activated, it brings us face to face with a familiar image. Alter Ego, who, wait, seriously, was that necessary? Who is the overseer of the Neo World program, but who can't actually manage much due to an apparent virus which has infected everything. Yes, it's confirmed this whole thing is a simulation, explaining the state of the island and how this school, under the virus's influence, can somehow exist in the space between the ruined door and the trial grounds we discovered. Alter Ego clarifies that a teacher NPC should have ideally been managing all of this, but was usurped, and the virus changed the world's parameters from one where violence shouldn't have existed in the first place into one where it was allowed. But how did the virus infect the program? Well, Alter Ego speculates it was probably hooked up externally, with some sort of memory drive that they could have physically uploaded. Oh. Trying to interrupt, Monokuma appears, but seemingly gets thrown into a frenzy of glitches as Hinata is pulled into a secret room, at which point somebody else contacts him through Alter Ego, somebody with a familiar silhouette. He can't hear us, but he can still talk, and he says on their end they've been forced to watch everything so far, unable to shut down the program as the virus took full control. With this brief opportunity to speak created by Alter Ego, he's here to deliver one message. He's sorry about how the virus has run rampant, and he wasn't even sure if the program would work at all, but he still wanted to put everyone into it because he wanted to save them. He clarifies that the password in Nezumi Castle was for emergencies, with the ruined door originally being meant for access after collecting the hope fragments from their fun-filled school trip. The password existed in case of a scenario like this, purposefully hidden in a place where Monokuma wouldn't be able to go. And the password itself, 11037, was chosen because someone close to me left that number to save me when I was in a dilemma. Ah, never change, Naegi, you bleeding heart, you. Claiming that he's sure that person will try to use the graduation exam to crush them all with despair, he pleads for them to endure it without giving up on hope until he gets there, because he has a secret to defeat them. A hidden command at the graduation exam site that can forcibly shut down the game, even superseding the teacher's authority. It requires over half the people to vote on it, which he claims he can do, if he gets the right number. Before he can clarify further, though, the connection is cut, and Hinata is launched back out to the classroom where Monokuma seemingly hasn't realized he was interrupted at all. With nothing left to learn and graduation looming ahead, Monokuma calls us down for the final class trial. And even if Hinata doesn't know where to go, we do. Walking slowly down a spiraling corridor of data behind that familiar red door, we reflect on everything that's led up to this point. Everything that's riding on this. And finally arrive back at the trial ground. It's time to put an end to this. By the end of this trial, everyone must choose to graduate or repeat, a majority decision of whether we'll stay on the island forever or escape from Jabberwock, putting an end to this twisted wonderland. Claiming that everyone here are just chump side characters meant to welcome the main players back, Monokuma gets things underway, and the graduation exam, the final trial, begins. As the world has truly collapsed around us, even the trial prep screen flashes glitches and distortion, the usual information crawl only able to desperately repeat the phrase, "Hello world," over and over again. And our first order of business is bringing to light the nature of this virtual world itself, and therein lies the explanation for quite a many things so far. Though I'll be honest, even if it does explain the much more over-the-top executions than were featured in the last game, I still tonally prefer those old executions. The more over-the-top they've gotten in SDR2, the more I feel like they've lost a little bit of that macabre impact, you know what I mean? Well, anyway, that all being said, how were our cast's avatar bodies created? Simply by removing their school memories, as we already knew had been stripped away. This also explains the strange newspaper clipping of Saionji, who had in reality undergone a growth spurt over her time in school, but removing those memories only allowed her to remember a time before she had grown that much. As much as they don't want to believe this, Kuzuryu chips in that it wouldn't be possible to simply not notice that much time passing otherwise, because with strangers it's one thing, but he spent almost his entire life by Pekoyama's side, and they would notice physical changes in each other right away. Furthermore, just because this is a virtual reality, it doesn't mean everything that happened was without consequence, because the sensations were all felt and processed as real by the cast's brains. As everything falls apart, the trial ground can only be seen as the mess of code that underlies its assembled fiction, encompassing the stand-ins of people who in effect no longer exist as they once were. The people who have died have very little chance of ever waking up, even if the program is shut down, because their brains experience death to such a convincing degree that it may well have fully left them catatonic. Monokuma even lampshades the all-a-dream trope in this moment by insisting that a game without real stakes like that wouldn't excite anyone. And indeed, frustratingly as always, he has a point. So, whoever put this program together is the enemy, right? The Future Foundation? That's what everyone starts to believe, but is that really the case given what we know? No. The Neo World program was for recovery, for healing from trauma, but it's been misused and altered by an outside force. Usami, or Monami, was the original observer, but was usurped by Monokuma, and her assistant Nanami no longer had any degree of control over the situation either after that. For that matter, Nanami, as the traitor, was never a real student at all, just an NPC made specifically to observe in the game. Don't say it. We'll get to that some other time. Monokuma even mocks everyone by saying they got themselves all worked up and attached to a game character, which may in fact be several degrees of irony removed from the actual player feeling sad at this reveal. That a fictional person in a game we're playing is herself a character, a fictional person in a game. As if he's asking us whether we really expected anything different, if by suspending our disbelief to engage with the fiction, we ever stopped recognizing that it was fiction in the first place. And if so, why? It's harrowing. Asking Monokuma if his calling the Future Foundation World Ender was all a bluff, he claims that it's actually a fitting name for those of us here. But before we can get more details, apparently the main cast has arrived. It's Makoto Naegi himself, straight out of Danganronpa 1. And honestly, this reveal is bonkers, but we have no time to slow down. He introduces himself as a member of the Future Foundation that's finally managed to get through. But despite claiming he wants to help us, he also says we have to reckon with what we're responsible for first. The reason we were put into this program to begin with, and our true identities. True identities, he says. But what could those be? Did any of the evidence we came across point to that? Well, obviously our group were survivors of Hope's Peak, right? The emails about 15 people being rescued insist as much. But what if there was more to it? What if there was a lot more to it? Oh no. Yes, indeed, the worst has come to pass. Strap in, folks, because this twist is a doozy. Those 15 survivors were Hinata and the gang, but they were also simultaneously the remnants of super high school level despair. All of the colorful characters we've gotten to know and love are the entourage of one Junko and Oshima. They're not just survivors of the apocalypse, they are the harbingers of it. Brought here, forced to suppress those memories, they've been living and struggling to return to an idyllic bliss that they were responsible for helping Junko destroy. And now, here they are, being tortured by the very despair that they helped propagate, all at the hands of a virus that replicates their former leader's single-minded obsession. That despair that murdered wantonly, that spread misery across the world, that despair which itself became the target of Komaeda when he learned the truth from the final Dead Room, profile information he destroyed before we could ever see it, and why he tried to kill everyone but Nanami, including himself. Now, it all leads up to this. The discovered despairs were propped into the newly experimental Neo World program with the goal of erasing the traumatic influence Junko and Oshima had over them. Erase their ties and loyalty to her born from the influence she exerted over them all. It's here that I want to take a step back from summary and commentary for a second to touch on something thematically that I failed to mention in the last video. Something made excellent note of by Kraftwerk in his Danganronpa videos. As theatrical and violent as all of this is, Danganronpa can also on its face be taken as something of a loaded metaphor for the school system, and particularly the Japanese one. In Japan, it's common to stress yourself for entrance exams to even just a good high school. And while school is the perfect incubator for academic stress, it's also usually regarded as a Japanese youth's only time to enjoy that youth, as they will commonly enter a relentless, all-consuming workforce afterward that monopolizes their time, their energy, and often deprives them of even the small comforts of spending that time with their friends and family. DR1 brought this fear to a thematic fever pitch, a frank examination of how a high-stress environment that often crushes our children to dust can at the same time feel like their only refuge from an even scarier world that they are ill-prepared to emerge into. Junko's ultimatum, then, of simply living in high school forever, is both the focal point of existential horror as the cast refuses to concede to that, but also finding themselves unable to face the reality waiting for them if they don't. Because staying in high school for the rest of your life is sadly a bit of lurid escapism that captures the minds of many people, when their only other option is that crushing reality and workforce that lies beyond it. But that's what it ultimately is, an escapism, that shies away from the possibility of even living your life to begin with. And it's why, despite their uncertainty, the DR1 cast leaves the school anyway, hoping to carve their own path rather than feel constrained to the ones they're told they can take. They choose to graduate because to leave school behind is to grow up. And growing up is a thankless, horrifying job that we all must undertake, finding our way even if the world around us tries with all its might to ensure that we can't. SDR2 then takes it from the perspective of those who could have never survived within those walls to begin with. All of the students in this cast are some form of social outcast, and now we know that they all fell susceptible to the rhetoric and madness of the ultimate doomer. So they clearly never had very high hopes for their futures beyond this point, much less their ability to cohabitate within schooling at all. Craftsdwarf said it before, and I'll say it again here. SDR2 is about the dropouts, the kids who were left behind by the system they were told to fit rigidly within, and weren't picked back up when they fell. This is what happens when a society leaves its young people to pick up the pieces without giving them the tools they need to actually, meaningfully accomplish that. The horrifying tasks the Despairs underwent weren't even at the expense solely of others, but also themselves, even mutilating themselves to affix part of Junko's corpse to them, hoping to absorb her despair. This proves enlightening to the sight of Komaida we saw in Chapter 0. So, what are our options? If we repeat, we stay on the virtual island. If we graduate, we wake up in the real-world bodies, memories of the game uploaded to said bodies, and all of the people who died so far staying dead. The latter is what we're being proposed, but something seems fishy. This Naegi who we've been talking to is just a bit too judgy for me to believe he's my sweet boy, and he's also really pushing the whole Future Foundation is the hope of the world yada yada thing. I mean, didn't he betray the Future Foundation just to get everyone here? Weren't the Future Foundation determined to kill the remnants on sight if they ever had them? When confronted on this, he wavers, and is fully unable to explain himself when asked why he decided to make the ruin password 11037. Having been found out, Monokuma disintegrates his virtual doppelganger. Yep, this Naegi was a total sham. What we've uncovered about the gang's identities was not, unfortunately, a lie, but even so, he was trying to push us towards the graduation option for a reason. What reason is that? Well, we should probably hear it from the horse's mouth, shouldn't we? As Monokuma claims to be entering his final form, one more DBZ reference for the road. He powers up Super Saiyan style and is unexpectedly crushed by an emerging, towering figure. That figure should be more than familiar to us by now. It's Junko Enoshima. But how is she here? We saw her die. Well, yeah, Junko is dead, but here's the kicker. When Alter Ego invaded her network back in DR1, she was able to study it and make her own AI, appropriately named Alter Ego Junko, in response. In short, while the physical Junko Enoshima has passed on into the great unknown, her personality, thoughts, feelings, and of course rhetoric have outlived her, enshrined in digital perpetuity and maliciously uploaded onto the Neo World program for the sole purpose of tormenting her former loyal. So what's the catch here? Apparently she claims her real graduation program will account for the deaths by resurrecting the dead, and that she had to modify the program for a long time to make that possible. Of course, when asked if that's what the countdown in Jabberwock Park represented, she simply pulls a classic Junko and claims it was all for show, something dramatic to spice up the proceedings, but effectively indicative of nothing at all. Instead, it was a test for herself to see if she could get everyone into the graduation program by the time the mark hit 0. But this is Junko we're talking about, so it wouldn't be unusual for her to get bored of her own idea halfway through. And again, resumes her pressuring to graduate, and her same suspicious ambiguity. Everyone's about to fall for it, but suddenly, the real Naegi shows up, having finally gotten in, to clue us in that there's more to this plan than meets the eye. The plan isn't in actuality to resurrect the dead, but instead to fill their husk-like bodies with copies of Alter Ego Junko. In short, everyone can upload their game selves back into their bodies in the outside world, but anyone who died along the way will be replaced by the Possession Junko clones, who will of course endeavor to repeat the tragedy all over again, or make it even worse just by making a world comprised purely of herself and her own despair. The only reason she couldn't just kill everyone for more bodies was because of the school trip rules specifying the observer's role as a non-violent third party. She could add rules, but she couldn't delete them, thus she had to stick to the structure of the game so far, and could only try to puppet us in the desired direction through other means of interference. In effect, this whole killing game was to indirectly free up bodies for use. But this shouldn't be our only option, right? There's still the shutdown sequence that Naegi mentioned back in the school, right? Junko argues that it's not possible to initiate it because it requires more than half of the 15 people to press graduate and repeat at the same time, which is impossible because too many people have died for a majority to be reached. But that's why Naegi hasn't come here alone. Who'd he bring? Why, none other than Kyoko Kirigiri and the real Byakuya Togami, of course, who is fittingly confused when Owari cries that she's so glad he's alive, but so confused that he's skinny. With these added faces, surely a majority can now be reached, right? Well, hold the phone. What does this option mean for everyone? Well, as Naegi clarifies, it means that the program will be deleted, and everyone will revert to how they were before. As in, their virtual memories will be lost, and they'll go back to being super high school level despair. He hopes that compared to the alternatives, we'd see the importance of preventing Junko from getting out, and endure with hope in our hearts to face what's scary and uncertain, but we're the dropouts, remember? We don't have the same faith that he does that things will turn out okay for us. And furthermore, forgetting everything that happened here? No way, too much has happened. We've had horrible experiences, but there were meaningful ones too. There were meaningful people. You can't just make them choose that. Furthermore, this whole thing has just been a fight between them and Junko anyway, and she claims this new cast were just chump side characters in this whole thing. This whole killing game was arranged not just to free up bodies for her to use, but also to lure the Future Foundation here and trap them in the virtual world afterward. And not only were they all used for this purpose, but prior to being put in the program, they agreed to it. Willingly, believing in Junko's cause so strong that they would subject themselves to it, even knowing what would happen to them, that blinded by the hold she had over them. But even after all of this, she's got another twist to throw our way. She was waiting for somebody after all. She's been waiting for the mastermind. And hold the phone, you might say, Junko is the one in control here. So, like last time, she's the mastermind, right? Well, no. That title belongs to the person who brought her along, who planted the virus in the program itself, who used her like she used them. Yep, she's waiting for Izuru Kamakura. And let's finally clear up this whole Izuru issue right here and now. Who is he? Sure, that is the name of the Hope's Peak Academy founder, but it's also the name of a person experimented on by the Academy who became a wielder of talent incarnate, and the super high school level Hope, who went on to be influenced by Junko and kill the student council members, right? So which is it? The answer is both, sort of, but mostly the latter. The Academy hid a lot about Kamakura because of the incident, but ostensibly the subject of this experiment was named after the founder, in line with his whole purpose of becoming mankind's hope. And that lab rat who became Izuru Kamakura 2.0 is very much alive, says Junko. Very much alive in the form of Hajime Hinata. Yes, indeed, in another buck wild twist to end all twists, our main character is also the main instigator of these horrible events. The blessed genius guinea pig lured to murder and responsible for injecting the Junko virus into the Neo World program was none other than Hinata himself, who was also turned by Hope's Peak Academy into Izuru Kamakura, a reserve corps student made the focus of the Hope Cultivation program due to his intense admiration of the Academy itself, his desperate need to be validated by the school he admired being ruthlessly exploited by the cold, scientific side of HPA's experimental roots. Their attempts to artificially create genius, to create talent, in their single-minded prioritization of utility over personhood, directly interfered with his brain, pushing his entire personality, his being, into the back of it, obscured and trapped until all of his processing power was made to consist solely of the subject of learning and doing. Hinata himself was more or less lobotomized, killed inside of his own body by the Academy he loved, who took advantage of that love to turn him into a soulless puppet, capable of no emotion, retaining none of his prior self, and only capable of coldly gathering skills. Is nearly anything more horrifying than that? Even Kirigiri is horrified by the implication of this. Is this really her father's legacy? And all of this breaks Hinata. It's not enough to simply know that this was done to him. It's not enough to know that the shutdown will return everyone to their former despair. It's not enough that all of them will forget Nanami ever existed at all. But now, he's being told that if he initiates the shutdown, he will lose himself. He will cease to exist. This last vestige of his brain, holding on to the memory of who he once was, will again wrestle back to the side of Kamakura, and Hajime Hinata will no longer be at all. And that's what makes Junko's proposal, her twisted graduation, all the more appealing. Even if everyone who died will be taken over, the survivors can upload themselves, right? Hinata can live, right? It's almost haunting how convincing she becomes at this juncture. Do you really have to sacrifice yourselves just to protect the world in the first place? She says. What if the world's hope is different from your hope? Even if the world is happy, it's meaningless if you aren't happy. Will you be able to endure such despair? Who are you going to endure it for? For people you've never met before? For people who don't even appreciate you? Does that sound like hope to you? And now, here, at this critical moment, she's responded to the end of the last game, and we're right back where we started. And now we are expected to ask ourselves, what now? What do we do? Where do we go? Is there a place where we even belong? I'd like to at this point bring up some passages from a particularly striking article written about Danganronpa by AVB, the creative lead behind games like We Know the Devil and Heaven Will Be Mine, among others. This article, in Searing Pink, was published on Medium on December 14th, 2014, and though much of it stands out as well put together, these bits in particular really solidify what I'm trying to get at here. The most believable thing in Danganronpa is that existentially despairing high school students destroy the entire world. It's not very realistic, sure, because no one ever offers teens the means to destroy the entire world, but it is pretty emotionally believable. I mean, I sure did want it. Answers to how the students had their memories of the world ending erased, or what the actual moment of despair so powerful just experiencing it destroyed all hope on the planet was, are deliberately and explicitly not given. That is kind of an audacious decision when way too much of contemporary science fiction and fantasy world-building takes such pride in creating and detailing and expounding on the complexity and consistency of a fictional universe without remembering to give you a reason to care why. Instead, Danganronpa has Junko declare she's not going to explain the plot device because the mechanics of how the world ended are irrelevant to why the world ended. I could explain it, but it wouldn't be any more believable, would it? Junko gets it. It would be trivial to detail a science-fictional device X that would make for a plausible explanation here, but that would require spending a lot of time and energy on the least relevant and important part of a story that is ultimately about sad teens dying. But why not completely forego a logical explanation when it's the emotional truth that's much more interesting? It's a game about the characters, and Danganronpa could never make the ending believable without Junko. Junko doesn't answer how the world ended, but she embodies the why. To use a murder mystery metaphor, Junko explains the motive, but not the method. And in this story, that's by far the most important part. Junko is hilarious and cute and beautiful and clever and has zero inhibitions and is very believably compelling to people who are realizing that the world is not a very good place and does not love them. Junko loves them, though, even if what she loves about people are their tragedies, not unlike the audience. Bad things happening feels real, and she loves that. She loves it when other people feel hopeless, but she loves feeling hopeless too. And because of that, she's terrifyingly invincible. And she is because she actually feels everything so strongly. She gets to have everything, the freedom to feel without ever feeling anything bad, because emotion itself is pleasant to her. Whether it's good or bad, it's an unbelievable premise, but Junko makes the idea of the world ending due to worldwide existential despair believable because of how she makes despair seductive. And she very much has, because now our cast can't even imagine what it will take for them to be saved anymore. They're at their wits' end, and Hinata is breaking down beyond anything he's gone through so far. He's losing himself. He can't choose. So wouldn't it just be easier to never choose anything? To just stay behind in this illusion forever? To never march toward the future? And thus, escapism wins again, as Junko pulls her best Dio Brando impression and freezes the world over. tempts them with the thought of an eternal tropical paradise that will never change. But suddenly, in the loop of that escapism, in the midst of that denial, Nanami speaks up. You guys aren't part of the game, right? And her voice reaches Hinata. How she's here doesn't really matter. It could just be a matter of the game collapsing and data scrambling. But here, in the darkness of nothing, she chats with him about what's happening and about what will happen, about his fears. But even if she ceases to exist, she says, even if her memory is erased inside of everyone, she will never disappear so long as everyone continues moving forward toward the future they created together. Furthermore, they shouldn't just be bound by the confines of a game because they're not part of the game. The roads being presented for them shouldn't be the only ones they can walk, right? Beyond that, shouldn't they be able to make their own if they truly wanted to? And I know I said earlier that I wish Nanami was better characterized, and I still maintain that. But this part breaks me every time. Let me give a little context before I go on, at the risk of sounding too personal. SDR2 came out in the West on September 2nd, 2014. I graduated from high school in early 2015. I got SDR2 right as it was coming out, and I finished it toward the latter part of my senior year. I was always somebody who felt like a general outcast in schooling. I was somebody who struggled with it, always, and never felt like I had a place to belong. My grades were struggling massively through problems nearly entirely out of my control, and even up until the very end of that year, I wasn't even certain whether I was going to graduate at all. There's a certain personal kind of hopelessness that this whole thing encompasses, that puts me right back into that place, that reminds me of exactly how it felt, and how it at times still feels. I didn't know the world I was going to emerge into, whether I was ready for it or whether I ever would be. I was scared back then, and even now I still am, a lot of the time. It's for that reason that when I first reached this bit of the game, toward the end of my high school tenure, sitting in a crowded classroom as I played this with headphones after finishing my work, I struggled, no joke, to make it through this scene without sobbing for everyone to see. I definitely shed tears, and plenty of them, stifling it all in a jacket that I wore year-round. Because those words didn't just reach Hinata, they reached me, through him. Having talent isn't the goal. There's something much more important than whether or not you have talent, right? What's important is that you believe in yourself. If you can't do that, no matter how much talent you possess, you will never be confident in yourself. Just like how you were in the past. But past Hinata is in the past. He's not the same Hinata who spent time with me and the others in this world. So it's going to be all right. I think it's time you finally had confidence in yourself. You guys are the only ones who have the right to decide your future, and the responsibility too. But if you can't choose either future, why don't you just create one? Even if this world is just a game, you guys aren't part of the game. You guys don't have to just choose a future. You should be able to create one as well. I guess what I'm trying to say is, if you just do it, things will turn out okay. If you just do it, huh? Yeah. If I just do it. Promising to help out in her own way, Nanami pushes us to face ourselves. The manifestation of Hinata's despair, his indecision, and his anxiety takes center stage, as Kamakura airs out their grievances for them both. I can't choose the future, he says. But as Nanami said, we don't have to just choose. We can create. Shooting down every bit of Kamakura's despair, climbing the mountain by our own will, we see Nanami off. Even if it's a convenient miracle, she says. If you just do it, things will turn out okay. Rattling ourselves to consciousness, we awaken to see everyone falling to despair. But we can't let that happen. We have to move forward, and we won't be constrained by anyone else's will. Not anymore. Creating our own will, our own power, we choose our own future, destroying every defeatist diatribe holding us back. Filled with some real Super Saiyan power, Hinata opens his eyes to the possibilities, stunning Junko into silence as she wonders if Kamakura has truly awakened once again. But in response, he can only say one thing.
I am not Izuru Kamakura! I am Hajime Hinata!
Slicing her words to pieces, we keep advancing. We boldly strive toward the finish line, and even deliver a rebuttal together with the friend we were sure we could never see again. Confident in our decision to shut this game down, we can create the future we want. What are you saying? There's no way something that convenient is going to happen, says Junko. But we respond without hesitation.
It wouldn't be strange if a miracle happened. This isn't a game! We can change the future as much as we want!
One by one, everyone sees their own light, their own driving purpose. Everyone abandons their fear, their anxiety, and their pain. They don't need to stay in school, but they don't need to graduate either. After all, they're the dropouts, right? They'll make their own way, and nobody can choose for them. Even if there's no telling how this will turn out, even if there's no guarantee it will turn out well, it's their future. It's theirs to make of what they will. They can't escape from the past. They can't stay frozen in the present. They can only endeavor to live, to break free from their trauma, to redefine what matters to them and to cast off their regrets. They won't lose themselves, because day by day we constantly change. We continuously become new people, and only we can decide what kind of person we'll become. That person, whether they were once lovely or once horrible, can strive to be confident, whole, and most importantly, hopeful. We may not be able to sculpt the world to our choosing, but we can sculpt ourselves, and we can decide how we'll interact with that world, and how we'll make it our own. Thoroughly tearing down Junko's ever-tempting doomerism with a simple but effective bit of confidence, Hinata brings us right back to where we need to be.
We believe in our future. That's what makes us different from you. We believe that if we try new things, even difficult things, that everything will turn out okay. We believe that we can create our own futures!
Opining that this isn't the end, but merely the beginning, everyone hovers their hands over both buttons simultaneously. They shut the game down. And in the midst of the crumbling world around them, ushering them forward into one last unknown, a last miracle occurs. Usami springs to life, destroying alter ego Junko, and leaving even the DR1 trio stunned at how thoroughly everyone took charge of their destinies. As all the code collapse, as the color disappears from everything, everyone stands, reaffirming their meaning of everything that's happened here, and their fondness for each other. They admit that they're scared, and who wouldn't be? But it's okay to be scared. That's the future. We'll carry it all, and we'll make something of it. Smiling calmly as everything fades, Hinata finally brings himself to thank Nanami for everything she's done. And as the program whittles down to its last breath, we hear her voice one final time.
私の方こそ、ありがとう。みんなのこと、忘れないよ。ずっとずっと、忘れないよ。この先も、どこかでみんなのことを応援しているからね。だって、ずっと仲間だもん。
In the epilogue, the trio return to their boat. They're unsure how they'll report to their higher-ups about what's happened, but Naigi's thinking about it. What they do know is that it doesn't seem like everyone's gone back to their despair status. Otherwise, they wouldn't have agreed to stay on the real-life Jabberwock Island. Though the chances are incredibly slim, they're already clinging to the hope of waking their catatonic friends. And so the path to what lies ahead continues to sprawl open.
Maybe for people like that, Naigi says, miracles are inevitable, don't you think?
As they depart towards their own paths, we're given one last glimpse at Hinata. He's cut his hair. He's accepted his new life.
Things are probably going to be a lot more difficult now, he admits. There's no such thing as an answered mystery. It's doubtful whether or not things will even end well. The future isn't a path. It's like an endless sea. You can try to go anywhere, but it doesn't mean you'll get there. Even so, I will keep on living. I will keep on living as Hajime Hinata. My future lies here.
And as the sun sets on the day before the future, so too does it set on Super Danganronpa 2, Farewell Despair Academy. And even if this ending seemed convenient, I can't imagine it going any other way. It should have gone this way, no question. And why do I think that? Well, to briefly come back to another quote from AVB's article, I never ever care about how the science fiction premise works. I promise, from the bottom of my heart, to believe in the explanation of absolutely anything you tell me, even if the explanation is I don't even feel like explaining it. Science fiction or fantasy isn't even a good way to describe Danganronpa. It's just pure anime. Reality cartoonishly distorted in ways that will make me feel real. My earnest belief is that science fiction or fantasy should do the same. Alter reality only insofar as it brings out the truth reality can't bear. I have no use for explanations that don't offer me that. And it's true. For as many problems as SDR2 has, I can't truly call it a perfect sequel. I think it has some tonal problems, and some writing problems. I don't think every character was utilized to their fullest potential, and I think even some of the better characters were handled pretty inconsiderately at times. I think too much of their legitimate trauma is reduced to gags, and I think some of those gags themselves are in distractingly poor taste. But even so, unlike Danganronpa 1, I truly believe that the bad is nearly negligible when it comes to the good. Even if I'd have something of a strange time recommending the original game, I have no reservations about recommending its sequel. It's a loaded game, and I do think your experience with it can only be felt as strongly if you play the first game for context, obviously. But aside from all of that, this is a sequel that's clearly improved itself in all the ways that matter most. Are there some annoying mechanics? Sure. Are there still writing issues, particularly with a lot of the female characters? Absolutely. But Super Danganronpa 2 feels like a compass. It drops you in the midst of a beautiful island with a sinister story, and then it asks you at the end of all that hardship to keep following the needle and to find your way. And honestly, every time I finish playing it, I feel like I can. I feel like that's something doable. And in a world where I'm so often crushed by the temptation to say that it's not, it helps, every once in a while, to get a reminder.
Even if you say fate made its own way, it's not going to stop. A piercing gunshot, a burning flesh wound, it festers and it aches. So I know it's hard, but you can't just turn your head away. No matter how light a touch the pain bites, it strongly stings. Blood always spilling, staining everything. I want all of this to stop. Yet it flows and flows, it won't take a no, even if you cry. So put your protests away and look right up ahead to the road someone has made. Feel no fear or regret, though the road is unmarked. It's the only way to go. So when despair turns into the bright hope that we all seek, though we can't see, we'll swipe at the fog all around us. Finally we'll be set free. When despair turns into hope in our hearts that can reveal what is missing, the shining road that continues on ahead toward our future. It will be ours to tread.
Hi everyone, thank you so much for watching this retrospective. I'm sorry it took longer than I expected, but first of all, look at that timestamp, and second of all, overworking yourself will force you to examine your priorities a little. As before, this is the second part of a desired full series retrospective, but how soon it continues depends on this video's performance. So please share around, comment, like, and all that good stuff if you'd like to see it keep on continuing, and to help this video succeed against the algorithm in general. If you haven't subscribed already, please consider doing so and ringing the bell. You won't miss my uploads when they come out that way. I have a Patreon listed below where you can support the further creation of my videos, and a Ko-fi for one-time donations. I also have a P.O. box set up now with Throne, so if you've ever wanted to send something my way without either of our personal informations being exposed, you can do so there. And that's all from me for today. I'll see you guys next time. Peace.